Science of Survival. Prediction of Human Behavior by L. Ron Hubbard. Acknowledgement. To 50,000 years of thinking men, without whose work Dianetics could never have been formulated. The credit is theirs, not mine. LRH. The goal of Dianetics. A world without insanity, without criminals, and without war. This is the goal of Dianetics. For thousands of years, man has struggled forward with his conquest of the material universe, but he has known almost nothing about his most important weapon, his most valuable possession, the human mind. Despite this obstacle of ignorance, he has made progress. But because of this obstacle, he has accumulated unto himself not only the penalties of madness and disease, but more important, the threat of destruction for all his works, modern war. Dianetics is the science of thought. The word is from the Greek dianous, dia, through, and nous, mind or soul. The scope of Dianetics includes all valid data pertaining to thought. Far simpler than man supposed, the workings of the human mind and knowledge itself become, in Dianetics, a body of knowledge with which any reasonably intelligent individual can work. No civilization can progress to the stability of continuous survival without certain and sure command of knowledge such as that contained in Dianetics. For Dianetics, skillfully used, can do exactly what it claims. It can, in the realm of the individual, prevent or alleviate insanity, neurosis, compulsions, and obsessions, and it can bring about physical well-being, removing the basic cause of some 70% of man's illnesses. It can, in the field of the family, bring about better accord and harmony. It can, in the field of nations or smaller groups, such as those of industry, improve management to a point where those pitifully inadequate ideologies for which men fight and die with such frightening earnestness can be laid aside in favor of a workable technology. Dianetics is pervasive. Human behavior and human thought are the foundation of human endeavor. Once one has an answer to these basic riddles, there is almost nothing which will not eventually resolve. But Dianetics is also, to some, a strange and frightening thing. It invades and enlightens so many fields and activities that it cannot but search out and expose those who profit by ignorance and suppression, and whose sole importance rests upon their ability to control other human beings. Where is the revolutionary leader who by teachings of hate and prejudice would unseat a government when his troops suddenly understand that the ideology he preaches is ancient and passé? Where is the society which existed to cure, but did not, some dread disease which Dianetics can nullify with ease? Where will such a society get more funds? And what of the practitioner who studied 12 long years to become an expert in exorcising demons from the insane, when he is suddenly informed that a few weeks of study in Dianetics qualifies any intelligent man to do a much better and much less harmful job? The sudden appearance of Dianetics upon a stage of conflicting ignorances about insanity, illness, hate, and war is dismaying indeed to those whose profit lies in conflict. After every war, there are countless generals listed among the unemployed. Dianetics could be said to be the beginning of the end of man's war with darkness and ignorance about his own mind, and many generals see their stars begin to fade. And what does a field do which has had for its fodder only random observation when into it are injected natural laws, demonstrably stable and accurate? One cannot quarrel with natural laws. At least the physical scientist, tamed some centuries since unlike his fellows in the humanities, has learned to accept the evidence of his senses. But the scientist in the humanities has never been educated into logic, mathematics, or even scientific methodology. He is a pretender on the fringe of the physical sciences, hoping to borrow some glory first begun by Newton. Thus, Dianetics has been beset to some degree by the many infamous pretenders and their respective bottles of Indian swamp root oil. The selling of these bottles was remunerative, astonishingly so, and their vendors would not quietly quit their stands in any case. Perhaps our present generation is too benighted for a new science, It would be very sad if it were true, for atom bombs are quite destructive to people and to towns, and might well obliterate whole cultures. Perhaps the vendors of crackpot ideologies and destructive therapies are too rich and too powerful and too selfish to permit a ray of hope upon our generation's stage. Perhaps it will be tomorrow, if tomorrow is let come, before Dianetics is used and widely applied. Dianetics was asked to vindicate itself in 1950. It did. This was very tolerant of Dianetics, for no existing ology pertaining to the human mind has ever been validated, nor has it been called upon to validate itself. The entrenched therapies flatly do not work. Their results are much the same as those which would have been achieved had no work been done. What sort of a society is this in which we live, where pretense is accepted as validity against all opposing facts? Dianetics works. None who have spent any time around the Foundation can doubt that. It even works in relatively unskilled hands. Daily it does its miracles, and this is not very strange, for Dianetics is root knowledge of human activity. But Dianetics is not a psychotherapy, and it is not psychosomatic medicine. Those who want and need these things find Dianetics swiftly efficacious in these fields, and so think of it as a psychotherapy. Those whose field it invades would love to have it outlawed before their boxes of beautiful swamp root oil have been discredited. Preventive Dianetics means more for humanity in the long run than Dianetic processing. Group Dianetics means more for these war-torn societies than any number of arthritis cures. Dianetics is the basic science of human thought. It embraces human activity and arranges a body of hitherto uncoordinated knowledge. Dianetics has a basic goal, a good goal, a goal which should not be discounted or thrown aside because some quack will lose his income or because some revolutionary will lose his crackpot cause. The goal of Dianetics is a sane world, a world without insanity, without criminals, and without war. If our generations live to write history, let them sadly give a page to those who, in this chaotic and dark age, sought through personal profit and through hate to bring a truly humanitarian science down. The goal of Dianetics is sanity. It can be stopped only by the insane. Introduction. This book is built around a chart. The Hubbard Chart of Human Evaluation and Dianetic Processing. See Audiobook Directory. On the many columns of this chart, we find the majority of the components of the human mind, and all those necessary to process an individual. In this book, we will take up these columns, one by one from left to right, and explain each column. When this has been done and you have read the book and thoroughly examined the chart, you will at least have the rudiments you need to process people. If you desire to process individuals on a limited basis, you may specialize in straight memory, lock reduction, and lock scanning. This can be done to almost anyone you would ordinarily contact without any harm, and with a great deal of improvement in his general tone. If you feel a little more adventurous, you can learn how to audit secondary engrams, and so become proficient in discharging grief and fear from a case. Should you desire to go the whole way and feel yourself competent, you can try running engrams on a case with a very close regard to the kind of case on which you try to run them. For a full education in Dianetic processing, the elements are here. But just as you went to high school to learn algebra or physics, you should take a foundation course in order to become a truly proficient auditor. Qualification at the foundation, coupled with any other training you may have, will permit you to become a professional practitioner. Most people, however, take a foundation course because they want to be better educated and to function better in their own professions. For Dianetics is not just processing. That's not a thousandth of it. Dianetics deals with thought and the behavior of men and groups, and those who know the subject thoroughly survive better. Simply reading this book, then, although it contains all the pertinent information, does not qualify an individual to practice professionally. But once he has thoroughly studied this book, he should be able to handle routine cases without difficulty. He should not try Dianetics on insane or severely neurotic persons unless he feels himself especially gifted in understanding or unless he has taken a qualification course at the foundation. This particularly applies to analysts and psychiatrists and medical doctors who, because they have concourse with the insane and the chronically ill, could achieve remarkably better and faster results with a knowledge of Dianetics. The science was made available to them in the past, and it is again urged that they take advantage of its techniques in the best interest of mankind and the advancement of their professions. Many physicians and psychologists have already been trained by the Foundation, and they, experience shows, have made good auditors. In the same vein, the layman should be very careful whom he allows to practice Dianetics upon him. Before submitting to Dianetic processing, the individual should either look for the auditor's certificate on the wall and see that it is in good order, or demand the right to give his auditor a test as to the various definitions contained in this volume. The individual who desires processing should not submit himself to a psychiatrist or a psychoanalyst or medical doctor for Dianetic treatment in the belief that they, as practitioners, know Dianetics. Only those psychoanalysts, medical doctors, and psychiatrists trained by the Foundation are fully qualified to handle the whole parade of skills necessary in an auditor. If your auditor is not qualified by the Foundation, then let him run straight memory, locks, and chains of locks on you until you are entirely satisfied he knows what he is doing. An auditor, by diligent study of this volume and by entering slowly into the use of his tools, making sure he understands each one of them progressively before using the next, can achieve great skill in processing. These cautionary remarks are addressed to those who, by haphazard reading of the volume, may attempt to plunge into the whole array of skills at once. This would be like trying to take a plane off the ground before one learns where the throttle is located and how to bank. Dianetics is not as difficult as flying a plane, but it is a technical subject. You can't drive anybody mad with standard Dianetic processing. You can make people somewhat unhappy. Cases driven mad by Dianetic processing do not exist. Cases do exist where reversed techniques have been criminally used on persons. Pain drug hypnosis can deliver anybody into a straitjacket with greater neatness and dispatch than anything hitherto known. Dianetic processing, however, has nothing to do with restimulating or planting engrams. So read what is written and get to know your chart. You will know more about men and women and their behavior when you have finished. If you feel you could stand some processing, come to the Foundation, or team up with somebody on whom you can rely, starting in with straight memory and locks, and studying as you work. If possible, get supervision from a Foundation-trained auditor, or take a basic or professional course. You can't know too much about this subject. No attempt is made in this volume to be literary or academic. I would happily take off a couple of years and write you something highly polished, but we're trying to get where we're going before the atom bomb gets there, and navigating the course takes a little time. So I've just written here what I know about this chart in a way I think you'll understand. The book is organized around the chart, not around the longest words in the dictionary. This is made possible by a certain difference between Dianetics and some other subjects. In those, the author has to make up in complication what he lacks in understanding of his subject, so the critics will be impressed. Damn the critics. Let's get down to paragraph 1 and open up to flank speed. There's a sane world to be won. L. Ron Hubbard, January 1951. Book 1, The Dynamics of Behavior. Chapter 1, Column A, The Tone Scale. From Funk and Wagnall's New Standard Dictionary, Supplement Number 5. Dianetics, noun, a system for the analysis, control, and development of human thought evolved from a set of coordinated axioms which also provide techniques for the treatment of a wide range of mental disorders and organic diseases. Term and doctrines introduced by L. Ron Hubbard, American engineer. Greek, Dianetikos, dia, through, plus nous, mind or soul. Dianetic, adjective. Assuming the basic idea that the sole fundamental of existence is survival, the problems of man's behavior apparently resolve rapidly. His interpersonal relations, the operation and purposes of his organizations and groups become understandable. Science is, to many people, a sacred cow. Actually, by definition, science is only the organization of apparently disrelated facts into a useful whole. Aligned on certain basic axioms, which can be found in Definitions and Axioms in this book, see audiobook directory, Dianetics is a useful body of knowledge by which may be resolved the puzzle of man and his behavior. A search for an energy of life begun in 1930 has been partially resolved by the discovery of the lowest common denominator of existence: survive. A gross error has been made by scientists in the past who sought materialistically to explain life on the basis of mud, chemicals, and electricity. It was the contention of these individuals that matter and electrical energy, operating in space and time, combined in some incredibly lucky moment to form a self-perpetuating unit, and that this item fortuitously grew, and one day man appeared on the scene. This childlike logic breaks down, if only on the basis of the odds against it. It breaks down again when evolution, as postulated, is seen to be of only limited usefulness, being actually as full of holes as an ocarina. The main test of any scientific hodgepodge is its usefulness to man. The mud-to-man theory, and it is just a crude theory, has not resolved man's behavior. These schools of thought gave men unlimited weapons, such as the atom bomb, and yet failed to give man sanity enough to regulate his own affairs or use the type of energy released by that bomb for purposes other than destroying towns. So we can conclude and lay in a quiet grave any and all scientific theories which have not led to peace on earth or have failed to give us a predominance of men of goodwill. Of course, there are lots of individuals who would like to go on having man believe he is basically mud. But to these we bequeath the electric shock machine and the prefrontal lobotomy, the highest level of operation to which the mud-to-man theory led. An examination of existence and the fondest hopes to which man has clung discovers for us the possibility that the energy of life is a different thing from the current flowing in a power line or the energy radiated by atomic fission. It is not necessary to have a vast knowledge of physics to conclude that life is something more than a mechanical contrivance rigged out of atoms and chemicals. In the first place, it follows only a few of the electromagnetic gravitic laws, and at best only vaguely parallels these. Life has its own performance rules. A further examination of life demonstrates that it is undoubtedly made up in part of matter, and that it exists in space and time. This is quite certain because a dead organism disintegrates into dust. Something has obviously ceased to be a part of this organism, however, the moment it fully died. This something has variously been called the human soul, the spirit, the life force. Bergson called it élan vital. The scientist who deals constantly with machines and chemical reactions has, for some decades, looked on a life organism as an oxygen-carbon motor, a heat-energy machine which operated not unlike a steam locomotive. He dismissed the wild variables this introduced into any attempted solution to life and living by the expansive statement that life was simply more complicated than machines men built, but that it was actually just another machine. A too complicated school of thought, a scientific masquerade, took up this argument and saw that it obfuscated any real explanation, or reason for one, and began to say that the human mind, being a part of a machine which was too complicated for biology and biochemistry, was of course too complicated to understand, being a part of a too complicated organism. It is felt that this waving aside of the problems of mind operation, this operation on the defeatist principle that the problem could not be solved, introduced therapies which were too complicated. It took 4 to 12 years to get an inkling of these therapies, and all evidence to hand, carefully compiled, shows that they do not work, that the problems of criminality, insanity, and war still remained, with these systems of therapy far out of control. The too complicated school of life and mind operation gives us a picture of a group of demon exorcists rushing around plague-ridden London a couple of centuries ago, telling everyone they had the solution to the plague, while some hundreds of thousands of Englishmen died the Black Death. With 19 million insane in the United States alone, with nations in the grip of madmen planning conquest, the too complicated school rushes about getting a good press on how well they are doing, while all the evidence says entirely otherwise. Thus, let us look for a simpler solution, one which does not require 12 years of schooling and practice to learn, one which will deliver to us a therapy and, more important, an understanding of life, man, and mind operation which can resolve the 19 million insane, our millions of criminals, and international madness. We find the first leg of this solution in considering life force, élan vital, or what have you, as an energy dissimilar to electrons in molecules and mud. The laws of this energy, once they are isolated and stated, are found to be parallel to, but dissimilar to, the laws of the physical universe. Let us call this life energy by a symbol in order to identify it. We will assign to it the Greek letter theta, and distinguish it as an energy existing separate and distinct from the physical universe as we know it. The physical universe would be the universe of matter, energy, space, and time. It would be the universe of the planets, their rocks, rivers, and oceans, the universe of stars and galaxies, the universe of burning suns and time. In this universe, we would not include theta as an integral portion, although theta obviously impinges upon it as life. From the first letters of the words matter, energy, space, and time, we can composite a new word, MEST. In Dianetics, we are dealing then with theta and MEST. Theta is thought, life force, élan vital, the spirit, the soul, or any other of the numerous definitions it has had for some thousands of years. As soon as we separate these two entities, a host of problems heretofore quite complex resolve into simplicity. Theta, we could say, comes from the universe of theta, which is different from the MEST universe. Theta has its own matter, ideas. It has its own energy and the characteristics of that energy. It has its own space of operation as distinct from MEST space. And it has its own time. There is an enormous amount of evidence to support theta as a postulate. Thought is instantaneous in the MEST universe so far as can be discovered. The flow of energy along nerves in an organism does not travel at light speed. Time and past of the MEST universe do not exist for theta. Considering theta, one finds that it alone, of observable energies, motivates and activates MEST matter and energy through space and time. Further, it computes, reasons, learns, and retains what it learns. Men building a computer with electronics, which would do only a part of what the human mind can do, would have to use enough electrical power to light New York City, enough cooling system to absorb Niagara Falls, and enough vacuum tubes, if they cost a cent apiece, to run up a bill of $1 million. And the apparatus so rigged, under the existing life term of tubes, would run a split second before stopping for tube replacement. The human mind does more than such a clumsy machine, does it better, lasts a lifetime, and, to cap it, is portable. Now, all a student of Dianetics needs to know and understand about all this is that theta plus MEST equals life. That theta and MEST have a natural affinity for each other and combine, linking the two universes, so to speak. That theta and MEST, coming together too hard, get into a turmoil, which we call pain. That the turbulence of theta and MEST, under the duress of too much impact, gives us a tone scale. Theta crushed too hard into MEST becomes N theta. MEST impinged upon by N theta becomes N MEST. N theta is simply a compound word, meaning enturbulated theta, and N MEST is another word, meaning enturbulated MEST. Consider that theta in its native state is pure reason, or at least pure potential reason. Consider that MEST in its native state is simply the chaotic physical universe, its chemicals and energies active in space and time. The cycle of existence for theta consists of a disorganized and painful smash into MEST, and then a withdrawal, with a knowledge of some of the laws of MEST, to come back and smash into MEST again. MEST could be considered to be under onslaught by theta. Theta could be considered to have as one of its missions, and its only mission where MEST is concerned, the conquest of the physical universe. MEST is under raid. Theta is doing the raiding. Theta survives by conquering MEST and retaining the conquest. Theta may have numerous other methods of survival, but they do not apply to this particular physical universe where we are situate. The survival of theta depends, as it applies to this universe, on changing Mest and organizing Mest. Life is a manifestation of theta conquered Mest. Theta has conquered and organized with high complexity certain Mest chemicals and energies into life forms. These forms are very diverse. They progress from the lowest orders, such as the lichens and moss, through the entire vegetable kingdom, through the animal kingdom, and up to man. Each form evolved from the initial impact of theta against Mest, and each form on a higher level is supported by lower-level forms. Without the lichen and the moss to make soil, no plant life could grow. Without plant life converting sunlight and chemicals into cellular food, no animals could live. Without the array of life forms below him, man could not support himself as an intelligent organism. Intelligence would be more or less wasted in lower forms. Evolution from lesser forms to greater forms exists in present time and wholly in present time. Evolution traced back along the time span is evolution traced through the Mest remaining after the theta had passed over it. Man alone of the animal and vegetable kingdom possesses the potential power of changing Mest in wholesale lots into something theta can use. Man can, by steam shovel and dynamite, move mountains and perhaps, who knows, conquer a galaxy. Theta thus evolves toward higher and higher reason and a higher and higher ability to conquer and change the physical universe. Mest. If we grant the cycle of recreation, growth, and decay, and the postulate that theta conquers Mest by first impinging solidly into it and learning about it, and then withdrawing to come back with what it has learned, we can see that theta learns by becoming enturbulated and then straightening itself out as an endless process. People have known this for a long while. One learns, they say, by hard knocks. That would be a simple way of saying that theta gets painfully mingled with Mest and withdraws to come back for an orderly conquest. If this is the cycle, and this assumption solves problems which were never solved before, then we can see that theta would have to have a withdrawal mechanism. And so it does. Death is that mechanism. Theta and Mest are attracted to each other, but when they become painfully mixed up, they become N-theta and N-Mest. N-theta rejects Mest. N-Mest rejects theta. Theta combines with theta or Mest. Mest combines with theta or Mest. Here we have something not unlike a chemical reaction. Two chemicals reside placidly with each other until stirred up. Stirred, they blow apart. Or we could liken this to a characteristic of some energies which, when they have their wavelengths changed, reject each other. This is death. Theta and Mest get too enturbulated and the organism dies. The remaining theta rejecting the Mest body rejecting the theta. There is nothing very complicated about this postulate, even though it solves a great many problems. One could say that when life becomes too painful, the body sickens and withers, and the soul departs. Man has for many ages inclined to a belief in free theta. Science became very unpopular when it sought to break down and abolish by logarithmic decree the human soul. However, we do not need a human soul to explain the theta-Mest separation called death, even though evidence is growing, good evidence of a highly scientific nature on a much more practical level than parapsychology, that the human soul does exist in fact. A man very high in the Catholic Church once said to me, "Young man, if you are not extremely careful, you will wind up by contacting the human soul as such and measuring it in ergs and dynes." Recently, at a major university, a group of well-done experiments demonstrated that living organisms had about them a field of energy which had a point source. If the energy radiated from the cells alone, according to past theory, the picture presented would have been quite different. Free theta, then, could be postulated to exist. The usual genetic line of generations begetting generations of like organisms explains, in accepted biological terms, the traverse of theta through generations. It seems inevitable that as Theta conquered Mest and made it into higher and more complex organisms, the problem of getting interbulated Theta and Mest separated for the next generation would be resolved at last on an intellectual level, and within one generation, Theta mastering the problem of smoothing itself out within the organism itself. Actually, at a swift glance, this is Dianetics. The defeat of death entirely is not wholly desirable. Evolution is set up to provide better and better organisms, better able to survive. Without death, all existing planetary space would soon be glutted with life which could not be supported. Death can take no holiday, but life can be much more effective, at least for the species called man. The cycle of conception, growth, decay, and death, according to our postulate of Theta and Mest, would be the cycle of pleasure and pain learning, by which the organism is refined so that the new generation it begets is better able to cope with the environment and conquer Mest than was the older generation. In one lifetime, there is much accumulated pain. The cells are subjected to pain by continual forceful contact with Mest, as in accidents or collision with other life forms. The whole organism, as an organism, is subjected to pain with every defeat in its efforts to fulfill its purposes of survival by a conquest of Mest. By pain, the cells learn new methods of construction for better survival. Out of organism pain, the organism learns new skills and methods of surviving. The hitch has been that once an organism was subjected to pain, it accumulated some knowledge, but it also accumulated some N-theta and N-mest. When it had accumulated enough to be highly ineffective, it died, leaving the next generation to carry on. For a man, this is not efficient. There is nothing wrong with his learning by pain and pleasure what is bad and good about existence. But there is a great deal in error with his having to carry with him an excess of N-theta and N-mest, which hide knowledge from him and cut down his ability to function in his proper role. Inevitably, a high form of life could be expected to resolve this N-theta, N-mest problem without an intervening death cycle. The N-mest N-theta turbulence is called in Dianetics an engram. An engram is an area in time when theta and mest have come forcefully together and have intermingled permanently. A small boy falls and hits his head. He is for an instant unconscious. As soon as he gets up, he may think he has a complete memory of what happened to him. But there is an instant which is occluded from his consciousness. That instant contains a turbulent area of N-theta and N-mest. A tiny bit of his theta and a small portion of mest have become a part of his unreasoning mind. This moment is an engram. There are two minds for our purposes. One is the analytical mind. The other is the reactive mind. The analytical mind is where theta coordinates and reasons for the organism. The reactive mind is where theta and mest have become enturbulated. The analytical mind operates by reason. The reactive mind operates by reaction. The reactive mind, having a different polarity than the analytical mind, has the capacity of compelling or inhibiting the organism in regard to certain of its actions. Lower forms of animals have this as their main method of thought. The reactive mind was once called the unconscious mind. It is a tough, rugged mind, which is alert during any moment of life, regardless of the presence of pain, and which records everything with idiotic faithfulness. It stores up the N-theta and N-mest of an accident with all the perceptics, sense messages, present during the unconsciousness resulting from the accident. Thus, the small boy who hit his head on the rock knows analytically that he fell and hit his head, perhaps, but he knows better with his reactive mind. Supposing the smell of dust was present in the accident, the reactive mind stored the perceptic of the smell of dust. The boy one day happens to be weary and to smell this identical smell. He becomes a little nervous. This is the reactive mind telling him to react and get out of here, because when this smell is present, one gets a bump on the head. That is not logical, but that is the way the reactive mind operates. If the boy does not leave the area and the smell of dust, the reactive mind turns on the pain in an effort to force him to leave. Finally, the boy learns to avoid the smell of dust because when he is tired, this smell makes his head ache. He does not like the smell of dust because, to the reactive mind, the smell of dust equals a bump on the head. With an analytical mind, the organism can think complex thought and is aware of being alive. With the reactive mind, the organism reacts in accordance with data received during the highest threat to survival, unconsciousness. So long as the reactive mind functioned in organisms which had not evolved language, it was a very workable mechanism. When an animal was injured, his reactive mind picked up all the perceptics regarding this injury, sounds, smells, tactile, sights, and whenever these appeared in the environment of the animal, his mind would make him run or fight. Thus, he was safeguarded by past moments of pain. It is a sort of shotgun method and has a thorough workability which, while it would deny the animal pleasure at times, at least kept him alive in a tooth and claw environment. When man evolved his analytical mind into a high enough level of action to need language, trouble set in. For the reactive mind could also contain words. Words heard during moments of unconsciousness, such as those spoken during operations or around a very ill or severely injured person, are faithfully recorded along with their pain. Like hypnotic suggestions, these recordings can be brought into play by a similar word or environment and cause the individual to act as though in the presence of danger. Restimulated by the environment, these past moments of physical pain and unconsciousness force the individual into obedience. Engrams, these moments of pain and unconsciousness stored in the reactive mind, act like hidden command posts in the mind, forcing the individual into patterns of thinking and behavior which are not called for by a reasonable appraisal of the situation. But the engram is not reasonable. It is simply a recording which has the sole purpose of steering the individual through supposed but usually non-existent dangers. Until Dianetics, the engram was not suspected, for it was well hidden as an entity. The word engram is an old one borrowed from biology. It means simply a lasting memory trace on a cell. It may be engraved on more than the cell, but up against Dianetic processing, it is not very lasting. Here, then, is a piece of n-theta n-mest, the engram. Mest and theta coming together too forcefully, as in an impact or injury, or getting inturbulated through illness, are stored in the reactive mind, and from there mechanically inturbulate the theta of the analytical mind into compulsive or obsessive action, or inturbulate the mest of the body into pain, deformity, or psychosomatic illnesses, chronic somatics, as they are called in Dianetics. Accumulate enough n-theta in the reactive mind, and the analytical mind becomes aberrated enough to commit suicide or to undertake non-survival activities in order to remove the organism from the world of organisms and let another generation take up the work. Let enough n-mest accumulate in the reactive mind, and the mest of the body will inturbulate into pains and illnesses which will kill the organism and serve the same purpose. This, then, is the basic assumption on which we are operating in Dianetics. The assumption is a workable postulate in that its application produces very advantageous results. The relatively sane person becomes more sane. The psychosomatically ill become well. The unhappy become able to obtain pleasure and lead happy lives. And we have a chance to bring about enough sanity among men to stop the mass murder of war. We can resolve the usual problems of behavior and set up a better organization. The person undertaking to process another individual dianetically is seeking only to raise the tone of that individual, in other words, to increase his survival potential. In order to do this, the processor simply regains for the other the theta involved in the reactive mind as n-theta. Theta is restored to the analytical mind. The reactive mind is left without its destructive store of turbulence, and the individual being processed becomes a Dianetic release, or clear. Column A on the chart is graduated as a tone scale. Actually, this scale has many more heights and levels than those we can now measure and use. How high it actually goes, we have no way of knowing at this time. For our purposes, it is put to use here between the levels of -3 and 4.0. At -3, we have simply mest, a dead body in whatever state of decay it might be. It is different from other mest only in that it has been organized by theta into new chemicals and compounds. For MEST is evolved into new complexities by theta, just as organisms are evolved by theta. At -1, for a short time after death, we have body cells alive. Some of these cells live for as much as a year after organism death, according to some investigators. This is, in any event, the band of cellular life, as different from organism life. At 0.0, we have death at the moment the theta withdraws from the organism. From 0.0 to 2.0, we have the band of operation of the reactive mind. Between these points on the tone scale, the reactive mind is in command of the organism. The reactive mind in this band directs the organism according to stored engrams and the analytical equivalent of the engram, the lock. From 2.0 to 4.0, we have the band of operation of the analytical mind. Above 4.0, we could postulate other mind levels, such as the aesthetic mind, through other minds, to the free theta mind, if such things exist. This tone scale shows the current level of survival of the organism. It shows also the potential of survival in terms of longevity of the organism, unless processing intervenes, of course. The higher the individual is upon the tone scale, the better chance he has of obtaining the wherewithal of living. The happier he is, the healthier his body will be. Actually, a person fluctuates on this scale from hour to hour and day to day. He receives good news, he goes momentarily to tone 3.0. He receives bad news, he may sink for a moment to tone 1.0. He falls in love, and for a month he is at level 3.5. His girl leaves him, and for a week he is at tone 0.5. When he is very young, he rides around tone 3.5. As he grows older, his tone drifts down to 2.5. As an old man, he may drift down to 0.0 and death, either slowly or swiftly. We are interested mainly in the average level for the individual for the period of life we are addressing. The average is fairly constant. An individual's average place on the chart can be gauged by inspecting the other columns. Thus, he may be an average 2.7 on the tone scale and yet reach 3.5 on occasion, and yet sink to 0.5 on other occasions, but only for a short time. The constant position on the tone scale is determined by 3 factors. The first is the accumulated n-theta in the person, how much of his theta is interpolated in engrams and analytical locks and so strikes back against him, forcing him into non-survival activities or compelling him or inhibiting him in environments containing imagined dangers. The second factor is the amount of theta the person has as life force. This would be his volume of theta. It is the third dimension on the chart. Terror is fear with lots of volume. One person has more volume of theta than another, and can thus stand to have more turbulence, more engrams. One may have so little native theta that half a dozen engrams will convert it all into n-theta, leaving the person insane. Another may have so much theta that thousands of engrams still leave him with enough actual theta to go on living a productive life in the 2.0 plus zone. The third factor is a ratio between the analytical mind and the reactive mind. An individual may have a reactive level of 1.0 and an analytical level of 3.5. The result is that when he is in a restimulative environment, he may be covertly hostile. But in a more favorable environment, he may be analytically very productive. These two minds average out to a constant. All the person doing processing, an auditor he is called in Dianetics, needs to know about this tone scale is that it gives the percentage of theta of the case which, by engrams and locks, has become chronically n-theta. To raise a person on this tone scale, it is only necessary to recover or convert theta from n-theta, remove, in other words, the stores of turbulence from a person's life, or render them unrestimulated. An auditor is not trying to cure anything. He is simply raising tone. Incidental to raising tone, psychosomatic ills commonly vanish and aberrations disappear. But this is incidental. The task is to make a human being happier, more effective, better able to accept responsibility and aid his fellow man. That the person being processed gets well in the period and stays well is a bonus. Anything which raises a person's tone can be considered legitimate processing. This includes, of course, nutrition, environment, and education, as well as processing. Simply taking the person to see a movie he wants to see may raise his tone. Processing achieves permanent raises in tone. If it is illegal anywhere to process people, then it must also, sequitur, be illegal to make people happy. And if laws exist against making people happy, somebody had better overthrow that government quick, for it is a death government, so n theta that it will bring about the death of the state and those within it. Chapter 2. Column B. Dianetic Evaluation. The goals of Dianetic processing form a graduated scale. Actually, this scale is also the scale of sanity, for there is a parallel between the amount of life force, theta, in the individual available for his survival and the amount of sanity he displays. Turbulence of this life force decreases not only his sanity, but his level of survival. The life expectancy of the individual is also proportional to his physical well-being, absence of factors which predispose him to illness, and his mental well-being. In other words, Dianetic processing is directly concerned with increasing the ability of the individual to survive, with increasing his sanity or ability to reason, his physical ability, and his general enjoyment of life. As we look at this scale, we are also looking at the emotional tones of the individual as he reduces an engram. There is a very direct relation between this scale and natural performance. As the individual reduces an engram under processing, he may find it in an apathy tone. As he recounts it the second or third time, he is found to be hostile to the personnel in the engram, but will not express that hostility. Then he begins to get angry with the personnel who have done this to him. The anger fades to antagonism. Then he becomes bored with the whole thing. Further recounting brings him into a cheerful frame of mind about it. And finally, he simply laughs over it. It was this sequence of behavior of an engram being reduced with processing which gave the clue to the existence of these points on the tone scale. At the top of the chart, we have levels of possible well-being which we have not yet explored, and which, while we have hopes, cannot at this time be reached. Our technology does not extend as far as derivation and observation say the individual may be able to go. In this range from 4.0 to 40.0 on the tone scale lie many possible states of being. What is the theta being? How much can man attain toward spirituality? How can full theta perceptics be best uncovered if they actually exist? These are some of the questions. The technology may possibly be developed which will permit man to reach a higher state than he can now attain by our current techniques of Dianetic processing. The highest point we can at this time reach with Dianetic processing is what is called here the MEST clear. There are probably several kinds of clears and several conditions of being clear. A MEST clear would be an individual who no longer retained engrams or locks, these having been erased by Dianetic processing. The erasure of all engrams and locks in an individual restores to him a full play of his endowment of theta. His store of theta may or may not be increased by other means. That would be a matter for solution above this level on the tone scale. A clear in Dianetics, then, is simply one whose engrams and locks are erased, and who does not become confused, obsessed, or impelled by past moments of physical pain. This goal is far, far beyond anything envisioned by such investigators as Freud. There may be goals far beyond the state of MEST clear. Currently, a clear will do. Psychometry and all tests for aberration demonstrate the clear to be unaberrated. His recalls are excellent. His mental stability is very good, since environmental circumstances cannot cause him to act irrationally by reason of aberrations. His emotion and ability to enjoy life are free. By becoming a clear, the individual attains an intelligence quotient far in excess of what he enjoyed before processing. A clear does not instantly grow wings or sprout a 10-kilowatt aura. He is not Superman, but he has his advantages. He has fewer accidents, and none because of his own doing. He is healthy. His education and experience are available for his use as he needs them. He acts on reason, and he reasons swiftly. His reaction time is about half the normals. What his longevity is, we have no way of knowing at this time, but we can only suppose that it is higher than if he had remained aberrated. A general tendency is to regard a clear as a sideshow piece. True, he is better than men have ever been before, but too much emphasis has been laid upon mental tricks a clear may be able to do. His ability to recall accurately, his ability to see again anything at which he has gazed. In the business of living, these things are not important. Happiness is important. The ability to arrange life and the environment so that living can be better enjoyed, the ability to tolerate the foibles of one's fellow humans, the ability to see the true factors in a situation and resolve problems of living with accuracy, the ability to accept and execute responsibility. These things are important. Life is not much worth living if it cannot be enjoyed. The clear enjoys living to a very full extent. He can stand up to situations which, when he was not cleared, would have reduced him to a shambles. The ability to live well and fully and to enjoy that living is the gift of the clear. Anyone looking for tricks can best find them in vaudeville. The clear has the advantage of not retaining, hidden from himself, pain and painful situations in his past, which, being restimulated by the environment, enturbulate his reason and sicken his body. The clear is produced simply by erasing all the engrams and locks, the pain and painful moments of the past. He is the current goal of Dianetic processing. He is called a clear because his basic personality, his self-determinism, his education and experience have been cleared of aberrative shadows. Actual experience demonstrates that man, once socially imposed controls and domination by others have been cleared away, is basically good. He is evil only when he is aberrated. Reduction of his aberrations discovers man to be well-intended toward his fellows. The highest reason in this world of complex interdependencies depends upon the highest cooperation of the individual with his fellows and his environment and a constructive attitude toward life. The more aberration, engrams and locks, cleared from an individual, the more independent and the more cooperative he is. There are 4 valid therapies, if we wish to use the term loosely. First, there is Dianetic processing. This rids the individual of the pain and painful emotion which aberrates his reason. Second, there is education. This indoctrinates the individual with the culture in which he lives and gives him the skills of survival, better enabling him to survive. The third is changing his environment into one which is less restimulative, is happier for him, and in which he can better survive. This would include nutrition, medical care, and recreation. The fourth is regulating the amount of mest which the individual should control. He can be given less if he has too much. He can be given more mest if he has not enough for his ratio of theta. Or the mest which he is trying to control may be changed for him into another kind of mest, sublimation. All 4 of these therapies do the same thing. They enhance the survival of the individual by giving him better tools of survival, better conditions in which to survive, better reasons for surviving. Any of these do one basic thing. They raise the individual on the tone scale. The reward of survival being pleasure, for instance, giving the individual pleasure raises his survival level. However, the last 3 of these are relatively ineffective if the individual has aberrations against pleasure or changing his environment or learning from life. And so we come to the conclusion that the first step toward a higher survival level would be ridding the individual of his aberrations. Within reasonable limits, the rest should follow. The auditor who is doing processing regularly and has been trained for it will use any method to raise the tone of his pre-clear. Pre-clear, any person undergoing Dianetic processing. For when the tone is raised, processing is easier. About all one can do with a thoroughly apathetic person is raise his tone by one of the last 3 methods. That done, he can be processed. Thus, we have the current final goal of processing, the clear. This is the long-range goal. It is not swiftly reached. It is reached, evidently, only by very good auditing and in the hands of an auditor who is somewhat higher on the tone scale than the pre-clear. A considerably nearer goal is the Dianetic release. The release has reached a point where he no longer has psychosomatic illnesses, where he has good stability, and where he can enjoy life. If one simply took all the secondary engrams off a case, one would have a Dianetic release. The Dianetic release is very high above normal, and itself has not been attained before by any past known methods of therapy. The psychometric testing of the usual Dianetic release shows him to be in very superior mental condition. An even nearer goal to the start of processing is the very high normal. By this is meant a person who is well above the current level of average intellect and behavior. One attains in processing levels one is capable of reaching by reason of genetic endowment, education, and current physical potentials. One becomes the best that can be made of what one is natively. Thus, a moron by genetic endowment would reach the level of moron when processed, but he would have been by reason of aberration around the level of idiot when he started. An average intellect by processing reaches a level of stability and capability very high above the average. Hence, to reach very high normal, one would have had to be not too much below average to begin. The use of the term average or normal is susceptible to considerable misunderstanding. It simply means the average of the population's intelligence and ability. It is remarkably low in the United States compared to what it could be, but the United States average is considerably higher than that of other nations. The next level is boredom. This is borderline between what is called neurotic and what is called normal. Moderate but unused ambition, a state of mind toward life which is not discontented nor yet contented, a purposelessness in living. These mark this stratum. It is a rather sorry stratum, actually, but it is so superior to what lies below it that the auditor who can get an anger case up to boredom considers he has done very well indeed, and so he has. Below this level we have the level of overt hostility. Here is the occasional grouch, the complaining individual who yet makes no mistake about what he finds wrong. The blunt, honest type who tactlessly tears up the tenderer feelings of his companions is found in this band. At 2.0, we cross the borderline between the reactive mind and the analytical mind control. And just below this, we get the anger band. Here is the person of rather continuous hatred. Here we have impulsive and destructive action. Below anger, we go into a slightly sorrier level, covert hostility. Here is the person who hates, but is afraid to say he hates, who deals in treachery, and who yet expects to be forgiven. At the lower end of covert or hidden hostility, we have the continually frightened person, the individual ridden by fears, the person who is afraid to be or to own anything. A far more serious level is the apathy level. Here is the suicide. Here is the person who has lost so much in life that he cannot rise to any situation, but simply gives up about everything. If the auditor can bring the apathy up to covert hostility, he has accomplished a rise in tone, but overt acts by the auditor are likely to drive the apathy case down toward complete paralysis or death itself. This is a very dangerous state of mind, bordering next door to death. Next, we have the lowest band of organic life, pretended death. Some animals have developed pretended death into a survival mechanism. Pretending death says, "I am not dangerous, I am dead, go away and leave me alone." The soldier on the battlefield who suddenly becomes paralyzed is using this mechanism. Some races, the Chinese in particular, descend into this stratum and actually die as a form of suicide, self-willed. The auditor who can get a pretended death case to open and close its eyes is achieving remarkable results. Finally, we have the band below death and the messed body, and on these we can do nothing, of course. The rightest right a man can have is to survive to infinity. The 0.0 level is death. How wrong can a person be? Dead. The higher a person can rise on this scale, the righter he is in terms of reason, in terms of survival, and in terms of general well-being. The higher he is, the happier. The lower he is, the sadder. The whole intent of processing is to raise the individual from lower to higher strata on this scale. Chapter 3. Column C. Behavior and Physiology. Under this column, we have data which is considerably more complex than any other section of this book, but which is of considerable interest to biologists and other scientists. The auditor need not suppose he needs to know it by heart or even understand its terms. What one should understand about this column is that it gives a clue to behavior and to physiology in an individual, or, in reverse, permits the auditor to better locate his preclear on the chart, which indeed is the purpose of many of these columns. There are three main actions by which life handles itself and mest. These are 1. Attack, 2. Retreat, 3. Neglect. These are broken down into their relative positions on the tone scale. Tone, 4.0. Behavior, motion toward, swift approach. Physiology, full control of autonomic by cortex. Both craniosacral and thoracolumbar systems of autonomic functioning at optimum under direction of cortex. Muscle tone excellent. Reactions excellent. Energy level high. Tone 3.5. Behavior, motion toward, approach. Physiology, moderate control of autonomic by cortex. Craniosacral functioning well. Thoracolumbar slightly depressed. Muscle tone good. Reactions good. Energy level moderate. Behavior, motion toward, slow approach. Autonomic functioning independent of cortex. Craniosacral functioning well. Slight activity in thoracolumbar. Muscle tone fair. Reactions fair. Energy level fair. Tone 3.0. Behavior, no motion, stay. Physiology, autonomic independent of cortex. Craniosacral functioning well but no activity in thoracolumbar. Muscle tone, reaction time, and energy level poor. Tone 2.5. Behavior, motion away, recede slowly. Physiology, autonomic begins to take over control. Craniosacral inhibited. Thoracolumbar up. Slight restlessness, heightened activity, wavering attention. Behavior, motion away, recede quickly. Physiology, increased activity thoracolumbar. Craniosacral more suppressed. Increased restlessness, wavering of attention, inability to concentrate. Tone 2.0. Behavior, motion toward, slow attack. Physiology, increased activity of thoracolumbar. Inhibition of craniosacral. Irritability, increased heart action. Spasmodic contractions of gastrointestinal tract. Respiration increased. Tone 1.5. Behavior, motion toward, violent attack. Physiology, full autonomic mobilization for violent attack. Complete inhibition of craniosacral. Thoracolumbar in full action. Respiration and pulse fast and deep. Stasis of gastrointestinal tract. Blood to peripheral vascular system. Tone 1.1. Behavior, motion away, slow retreat. Physiology, autonomic settles down to chronic rage reaction. Inhibition of craniosacral. Imperfect gastrointestinal action. Increased peripheral vascular circulation. Increased pulse and respiration. Tone 0.9. Behavior, motion away, violent flight. Physiology, autonomic mobilization for full flight reaction. Laxity of gastrointestinal tract. All blood to peripheral vascular system, especially muscles for rapid flight. Breathing and pulse rapid and shallow. Tone 0.5. Behavior, slight motion, agitation in one place, suffer. Physiology, autonomic mobilized for cry for help, grief. Craniosacral on full, thoracolumbar inhibited. Deep, sobbing breathing, pulse hard and irregular. Discharge of tears and other bodily secretions. Tone 0.1. Behavior, no motion, apparent death. Physiology, shock reaction, thoracolumbar inhibited. Craniosacral full on, gradually decreasing as organism approaches death. Breathing shallow and irregular. Pulse thready. Blood pooled in internal organs. Muscles limp, lacking tone. Pallor. Tone 0.0. Behavior, death. Physiology, cessation of organic function. Chapter 4. Column D. Psychiatric Range. The auditor should know 3 psychiatric terms, the only psychiatric terms he will find used in Dianetics as they are used in psychiatry. These terms are 1. Psychotic, 2. Neurotic, 3. Psychosomatic. Psychotic is really not a noun, but an adjective. However, psychiatry uses it as a noun to mean an individual afflicted with psychosis. A psychosis is any major form of mental affliction or disease. In other words, a psychotic, so far as we are concerned, is an individual who cannot handle himself or his environment well enough to survive, and who must be cared for to protect others from him or to protect him from himself. The psychotic state which receives the most interest is that one which threatens the survival of the individual himself or of those around him. Such a psychotic is placed in an institution when there is room for him. Otherwise, he roams the town or country. However, many other persons are psychotics, but are not sufficiently alarming as a menace to themselves or others to be placed in an institution. The next classification is simply a matter of degree. The neurotic individual is one who is afflicted mentally, but can perform some reasonable function or other. The term psychosomatic has meant an illness caused by or notably influenced by the emotional state of the patient. Actually, more practically, one could say that it is an illness caused by the mind. About 70% of man's ills are psychosomatic. In Dianetics, we use these terms as follows. Psychotic, a person who is physically or mentally harmful to those about him out of proportion to the amount of use he is to them. Neurotic, a person who is mainly harmful to himself by reason of his aberrations, but not to the point of suicide. Chronic somatic, a psychosomatic illness, since it is discovered that psychosomatic illness is only the restimulated somatic of some engram and goes away when the engram is contacted and reduced or erased. As for other psychiatric classifications, these are famous even to psychiatry for their looseness and disorganized state. One institution, for instance, handles schizophrenics only, and so any patient who comes there is simply classified as a schizophrenic. Psychology has long laughed at psychiatry because psychiatric terminology described some manifestation and led to no cure. This was because psychiatry did not know the cause of any manifestation and could not cure either the cause or the manifestation. This current chart gives a scale by which psychosis and neurosis can be accurately classified and described for the first time. However, Dianetics does not need a more complex terminology than it has. Definition of individual tone level by numbers, plus the citing of obviously manifested engrams, give adequate clue to what should be done for the preclear. The individualities of psychosis and neurosis are occasioned by the engrams of a particular psychotic or neurotic. These peculiarities of behavior have as their roots certain engrammic commands, words contained in past moments of pain and unconsciousness. An engram can bring about a manic state, wherein the individual declares hysterically and continually that he is happy or strong, and yet is very low on the scale. Such a condition is brought into view by the auditor, inspecting the chart for various other manifestations of the preclear. Any one column or characteristic of the chart can be altered by one pattern of engrams or severe education, but the other portions of the chart will remain constant for that level. For instance, as in the case of a manic engram, the individual appears to be happy at first glance, even says so repeatedly. But further inspection demonstrates that this person is very shy, that he gives presents to buy people off, that he is given to suspicion and hurtful lies about people. The manic engram commands a tone 3.5 be manifested, but this does not alter the position of the preclear on the chart. This is not very complicated, and it is very important. To establish the level of sanity on the chart, the auditor must only locate the level which contains a majority of the manifestations of the preclear. Almost every case will have a place on the chart which does not hold true on the chart for the majority of characteristics named. In other words, Look for the majority of characteristics, the level where the preclear is found in most of the columns. Do not be upset if the preclear fails to hold true in one or two columns. A chain of engrams may command a manic or a depressive aspect in the preclear for a particular subject or column. Engrams which command, for one subject on the chart or one characteristic in life, a tone lower than the actual tone of the preclear may be hard on the preclear, but they have a certain safety factor for the auditor. It is the manic which commands by engrams a higher tone in one or two columns than the actual tone that is dangerous. For then the auditor may try to use a level of processing too high on the chart for his case. If in doubt, work the preclear a tone or two lower than you estimate him by the chart. The potential manic depressive psychotic can be hammered into a psychotic break by being worked too forcefully too high on the chart. A saving grace in diagnosis is that a manic depressive is not always a manic or above tone, but is often depressive and well below tone. None but a qualified auditor has any business working with a psychotic. The danger in handling psychotics is very great. This danger did not originate with Dianetics. From the beginning of man's efforts to solve the riddle of insanity, the psychotic has been a great liability to the practitioner. The percentage of psychotics who commit suicide during ordinary treatment is vastly larger than the percentage of suicides of psychotics during Dianetic processing. The conclusion one reaches is that psychotics commit suicide easily. They commit suicide more often when in the hands of other practitioners than in the hands of those who know Dianetics. In the case of insanity, almost any excuse is acceptable to the law. The inept practitioner who has just lost a patient to suicide for the 39th time can lean back, look learned and grave, and say, "Well, he came to me too late. If I had had him a couple of months earlier, I could have saved him." This alibi is not recommended to auditors if for no other reason than that it is quite shop-worn. Besides, no Dianeticist to date has ever had occasion to use it, and probably never will. When a person drops below the 2.0 level, he has so much n-theta compared to his theta that a sudden shock may simply inturbulate the remaining theta and send him into a psychotic break. When all the theta is inturbulated, its reaction is to kick apart theta and mest. In other words, cause death and remove the organism from the path of other organisms. Suicides are assisted normally by engrams which specifically command suicide. But suicide is a natural manifestation, apparently, a fast means of separating theta and mest and gaining death quickly. Suicide is always psychotic. People below the 2.0 level, no matter their avowed intention, will bring death or injury to persons, things, and organizations around them if in the anger bracket, or death to themselves if in the apathy bracket. Anyone below the 2.0 level is a potential suicide. The fascist, for instance, is almost always, in the face of any severe reverse, a sure suicide, fascism being below the 2.0 line. A psychotic is a threat of death for somebody or something if not for himself. A manic depressive, sometimes cheerful and apparently only neurotic, is actually very low on the scale and may suddenly commit suicide without any real warning. The psychotic is a definite liability to the auditor, not so much because of processing or what unskilled processing may do, but because some factor may come suddenly into the environment of the psychotic which causes him to commit murder or suicide. This can then be laid to the processing. Every such action on the part of psychiatric patients is forgiven psychiatry as a natural consequence of handling psychotics. Handle one gently and keep him out of a non-survival environment, and the psychotic may be very successfully treated by Dianetics. But do not be amazed if your preclear seems cheerful today and goes into a psychotic break tonight and commits suicide tomorrow after murdering the family. Below 2.0 on the tone scale, we have theta and mest trying to kick apart and bring about death. One of our most brilliant instructors, David Carey, in the Los Angeles Foundation, had married long before Dianetics a psychotic girl. He went into Dianetics first, trying to help her. He persuaded her to take a course with him at the Foundation. He tried in every way he could to give her processing. But as she was actually there under protest, she would not accept processing from him. Carey went on to become an instructor, having an excellent background for teaching and a skill in it, while she separated herself from him. She was not obviously psychotic, although the training department at Los Angeles had refused her as far below student caliber on the grounds of her psychometry and a former suicide attempt, and was only persuaded to take her as a favor to Carey. Sometime later, in an effort to bring her some relief, Carey took a leave of absence and went home. There he was murdered by his wife, who then committed suicide. His devotion and his efforts to assist her had been unmistakable. She had been intensely inaccessible. He had been told many times by his friends in Dianetics that she was dangerous, but that danger was hidden. Carey's devotion cost him his life and cost Dianetics a brilliant instructor and a man well loved by all who had a chance to know him. This footnote is included here not simply as a memorial to David Carey, but as information which will give pause to husbands or wives who are seeking to assist a psychotic spouse. Husband and wife auditing is difficult at best, the partners being usually very restimulative to each other. As husband and wife, they will do better to make an arrangement for auditing with another couple. If one of them is psychotic, they should seek the best professional auditor Dianetics can give them. Further, in treating psychotics, always remember that one is working with minimal theta present and maximal n-theta. Thus, a sudden shock may so restimulate an engram that the remaining theta interbulates and vanishes, leaving a lock composed of n-theta. There goes sanity. Approach the lock gently and turn it back into theta with great care and caution. No mixture of Dianetics with old treatments or practices of any kind is recommended to the auditor. Electric shock has been found to lay a severe engram into an already overcrowded reactive mind, and is not successful in any way other than making a few patients so apathetic that they are barely acceptable to society. Psychosurgery, removing pieces of the brain, has long been acknowledged an entire failure so far as any actual cure is concerned. Free association is a long drawn-out procedure which, although it has had some success in rehabilitating patients who were not too near the bottom of the tone scale, is in the long run of questionable value. Restraints and cold packs only succeed in shocking the patient into a deeper state of lethargy. Do not condone such methods, nor permit them to be used on your pre-clears for the simple reason, aside from their inhuman aspects, that they do not work. They only sap the remaining stamina from the patient. Why cling to old-fashioned and even barbaric methods when Dianetics provides surer, more effective, and humane techniques? Handle the psychotic gently. Respect his rights to a whole brain and a future. Do not consider that he is your toy or your experimental animal for vivisection or strange, sadistic treatment. Above all, when you are auditing, be a civilized human being. Don't try to punish your patient because he refuses to get well. His engrams and general turbulence make your pre-clear very hard to reach. His basic personality is in there trying to help you. Smooth out n-theta and make theta out of it, and do it as gently as you can. Don't lose your temper or resort to drastic methods. Be civilized. Man can be handled only with reason, not by Hitlerianistic force. You can't beat a man into sanity. If you feel so exasperated by a pre-clear that you would like to scold him or hit him, stop the session and go cool down. Don't fill him full of sedatives or put him in restraints. By being as gracious and serene as you possibly can be, you will greatly increase your success in treating your fellow man. And you have to be first cousin to a saint to get the best results with psychotics. Any effort made to hammer a patient or scold a patient into sanity will meet with failure. The proof of that is the 19 million insane, institutionalized or at liberty in the United States alone. Don't be convinced that you have rights of ownership or life and death powers over your fellow man. Leave that to the accomplished authoritarians, of whom we unfortunately have so many. Be a human being and you'll get good results. Chapter 5. Column E. Medical Range. The medical doctor a short time ago seldom thought of his patients in terms of mental disorder. Recently he realized that some 70% of man's ills are of mental origin, which is to say psychosomatic illnesses account for a high majority of sicknesses. In addition to those commonly listed as psychosomatic illnesses, Many others must be suspected because of another factor. Bacterial infection itself is assisted by the presence of engrams. Thus, the percentage is possibly much higher. The engram assists bacteria and viruses in this fashion. The physical injury, the nest of the engram, resides in a certain portion of the body, that portion which was injured. Let us say an engram is received by reason of a severe chest injury. This engram may not become active for many years, but keyed in, then it brings about a chest weakness in that the blood and endocrine fluids tend to avoid the area as though it were just now injured. Into this weakened area may come bacteria of one kind or another, such as those of pneumonia or tuberculosis. This is a temporary infection. But now the area is restimulated by the pain of the infection, and so the engram is further keyed in and reinforced, and the area of the chest cannot become resistant enough to throw aside the infection. Thus we get the chronic infections, the lasting illnesses. Technically, one can say there are 3 phases in a disease. 1. Predisposition. 2. Precipitation. 3. Perpetuation. The engram accounts for these in that it renders an area of the body or an organ, such as the heart, weak. Then, by the key-in of the engram, brings about the illness. And finally, because the keyed-in pain keeps on being restimulated, makes the illness continue. As far as injuries are concerned, engrams apparently cause the accident-prone. The engram may command the person to injure himself or others. One such engram restimulated in a preclear caused him to, unwittingly, injure his hand severely 3 times in 1 week. The engram was found and reduced, and the preclear has not since injured that hand. Thus, accidents of major and minor character may be chalked up to engrams. A command in an engram, such as, "I always have to hurt myself," will cause the individual to do just that. The endocrine system is very sensitive to thought and is under the control of thought. A doctor who attended a series of lectures on Dianetics at length came forward and, rather disturbed, said, "For 40 years of study and practice, I have been using the standard concept that structure controls function. I finally see what you are saying. It is the other way around. Function controls structure. Now maybe we can solve a few more problems." Endocrine imbalances such as reduced thyroid, overweight, reduced sexual capability, sterility, and numerous others are monitored by engrams. The proof of this is simply that when engrams are reduced, the glandular imbalances tend to correct themselves. Also, engrams reduce the acceptance by the body of artificial hormones, for when engrams are reduced, artificial hormones can be administered with benefit. There is a direct index between the amount of N-theta in an individual and his physical health. This is manifest when one examines the state of health of the psychotic. A pretended death case is almost impossible to keep alive. Apathy cases starve and develop illnesses and cannot resist the smallest infections, just as grief shocks are so often followed by illness. The covertly hostile individual is usually a hypochondriac, is continually developing illnesses which even he knows to be false. The anger case suffers from all manner of ills, particularly arthritis and other illnesses, which settle as chronic somatics and develop deposits, which enlarge glands, which alter the condition of the heart, and so forth. From there on up the scale, the less N-theta and the more theta, the greater the physical health of the individual. As an example, a young girl was in a hospital recovering from appendicitis. She was running a fever, a very serious thing in such a case. An auditor was called in, and by a few questions found out she was stuck on the time track in an earlier mumps engram. He brought her up to present time, and the temperature dropped to normal within the next 10 minutes, and recovery then proceeded uneventfully. A usually well but temporarily ill person slides down the tone scale because of temporarily restimulated engrams. Getting him into present time will often materially shorten any course of illness. Another part of medical Dianetics is the Dianetic Assist. Any very recent engram can be run with impunity. Picking up engrams of injuries which have just happened demonstrably shortens the term of recovery and increases life potential threatened because of the accident. Shock occasioned by operations and accidents is rendered less dangerous according to Dianetic observation by the Dianetic assist. In preventive Dianetics, the first rule is maintain silence around an injured or ill person. This prevents the engram from having words in it and reduces its dangerousness markedly. Several hospitals now practice this. Doctors in other hospitals would find their work much easier and more successful if they would simply make standard the practice of complete silence around operating tables. It should not be overlooked by the auditor, regardless of his ability to do near miracles in the face of physical malady, that virus, bacteria, and broken legs still exist. The auditor would do well to recognize the function of the medical doctor as a primary necessity in a society. When an artery is pumping the life of the patient out upon the ground, the engram being received is the least important part of the circumstance. The important thing is to inhibit the artery. Picking up an engram will not heal, but will only assist the healing of broken bones. While most surgery, by the admission of surgeons themselves, is unnecessary, only surgery can effect emergency repairs. The field of the medical doctor is evidently the field of the acutely ill, and it is a wise auditor who works smoothly and harmoniously with medical doctors in the full recognition that medicine is often the only means of preserving or extending life. The auditor's job is to shorten the course of any illness, to assist the healing of any injury, and particularly to bring people up the tone scale to a level where they will seldom fall victim to accident or illness. Chapter 6. The Basic Laws of Theta. Affinity, Reality, Communication. There is in Dianetics a triangle of great importance. Theta, the energy of thought and life, has as primary manifestations affinity, reality, and communication. ARC. This is the peculiarity of Theta. In lieu of the cohesion, matter, and force laws of the physical universe, MEST, thought, Theta, has to have affinity, reality, and communication to survive. MEST requires certain laws to survive or obeys those laws in the business of surviving. Energy and matter in space and time hang together in a certain fashion, governed by certain laws. The discovery and use of those MEST laws make up the science of physics. Theta also hangs together in a certain fashion, and the discovery and use of those laws make up the science of Dianetics. We do not know nearly as much about Theta as we know about atoms and electrons, the probable parallel entity in the physical universe. Electrons, protons, neutrons, and various other parts of physical universe energy flow at certain speeds and, in various combinations, exist and function in the physical universe. There is, for instance, the speed of light. There is the composition of atoms and molecules. Theta probably has various similar laws, and at this time we do not know much about them. But we know enough to know that there is a difference between Theta's laws of function and those of the energies in the physical universe. Primary among the laws of Theta is that it has a fundamental goal, the changing of MEST. It changes MEST by constructing it into mobile units we know as life organisms, and through those, making MEST into various forms and objects or destroying those forms and objects. Theta uses an evolutionary scale in present time. Lower forms of life support higher forms of life. We have thought of evolution in the past as something stretched out back down the eons, as a graduated scale of various species which changed as the ages progressed down to our present life forms. This concept of evolution has many limitations and gaps, and is not very workable. In Dianetics, using the Theta theory, we see that all Theta is actually in present time and that no action is possible except in present time, and that present time is a continuing series of instants in which, moment to moment, Theta goes on changing MEST. It is not very complicated to see that right here in present time we have evolution operating. The lichen and moss convert crude MEST ash and rock into soil. On this soil, higher forms of plant life can grow. Vegetable life, however, is not very mobile. Theta animates organisms which are composed of Theta and MEST, but trees change very little MEST. Thus, following up the scale, we find Theta involved with making animals and insects, and the larger animals, unable to live on soil and sunlight, live on vegetable forms which are themselves the converters of soil and sunlight into comestibles for higher forms. As soon as we get up to the very complex forms of life, such as the mammal, we find a very large amount of mest being converted. When we arrive at the level of man, we begin to see that theta can create or destroy vast forms of mest. A man damming a river and installing a hydroelectric plant is, for his own survival, changing mest. Another man turning a switch and lighting an electric bulb is shifting and altering mest. Theta on this chain of evolution right in present time exists in a state which can change a very great deal of mest. As we learn more and more about mest, we can change more mest. And as we learn more about theta, we can control and change more mest. The atom bomb is a case of changing a great deal of mest in a direction which defeats a great deal of theta. Thus, we consider the bomb wrong. It fails to enhance survival. Man can reasonably change large amounts of mest. Therefore, he can be considered a sort of intermediate goal. Lower life forms cannot change mest on any grand scale. Man potentially can build or blow up planets. Man will evolve into more than man, probably. Educationally, he evolves a long distance when he begins to understand something about his own purpose of being. The cycle by which theta understands mest is a very simple one. Theta impinges heavily against mest. This causes a turbulence. But from that confusion, theta extracts some tiny law of mest and withdraws to apply to mest this newly learned law for the conquest of mest. No knowledge exists without a primary interpolation. Mest is conquered by theta taking successive laws of mest and turning mest against mest to change it. Theta, with this mechanism of turbulence, can learn much about mest. But if theta is going to be embroiled with mest in a disorderly fashion, then theta must have some means of becoming uninterpolated so as to profit by what it has learned through the confusion. Theta has to be able to withdraw in order to come back for an orderly conquest of mest, using the laws of the physical universe to conquer the physical universe. The basic mechanism theta had in the past was death. The cycle of creation, growth, decay, and death was one and is one which applies to a species as a species, to an organism as an organism, or to a group of organisms. The only way theta could get free, evidently, was through death. With the advent of a science of thought, whereby some of the natural laws of theta are understood, man can in one lifetime disinterpolate his theta and mest and benefit from the experience gained by the interpolance. What Dianetics does to longevity has not even been surveyed, but it certainly upsets the evident purpose of the death cycle. In Dianetics, we have much to do with affinity, reality, and communication. Whatever the accuracy of the basic postulates, it becomes evident to the auditor as he uses these 3 points of the triangle that he has a highly useful tool. The triangle of affinity, reality, and communication could be called an interactive triangle, in that no point of it can be raised without affecting the other 2 points and raising them, and no point of it can be lowered without affecting the other 2 points. The postulated reason for this is that affinity, reality, and communication are component parts of theta, and thus affinity, reality, and communication are 3 manifestations of the same thing. See the tone scale in the audiobook directory. This has a very high usefulness to the auditor. For instance, when his pre-clear has a very thorough sonic shutoff, the auditor knows that he can regain some sonic either by increasing the present time affinity of the pre-clear or by raising the level of reality of the pre-clear. Likewise, if the affinity of the pre-clear is markedly low, the auditor can raise that affinity by bettering the communication and reality concepts of the pre-clear. And finally, when the reality of the pre-clear is low, it can be raised by increasing affinity and communication. This is highly useful because often the auditor cannot directly discover the suppressor on one point of the triangle. By blowing locks on the other 2 points, he can make this suppressor accessible. Whether or not one either understands or agrees with the theta-mest theory of Dianetics, the affinity, reality, and communication postulate which derives directly from it is of infinite use. It is very difficult to suppress the affinity of an individual, his capacity, that is, to receive or give love, without also suppressing his communication and reality factors. Likewise, one cannot suppress the communication factor without also suppressing the affinity and reality factors. And finally, one cannot suppress reality without suppressing affinity and communication. For instance, a mother telling a child that she does not love it is also forbidding the child to speak and is blunting the child's reality, since the child normally expects to be loved. To tell the child to keep quiet is also to reject the child and is to offend the child's concept of what the real world should contain. Contradicting one of the child's statements or beliefs, which is to say his reality, is also to break affinity with him and to suppress his communication. One cannot touch this triangle at any point without affecting the other 2 points, and yet each point is highly specific and has its own characteristics. One must also consider, in a discussion of theta, that theta is measured on a gradient tone scale from 0.0 upwards to 40.0. At the highest range, theta could be considered to be in a pure state. It would be a clear, even-flowing river. It would be reason at its highest. It would be complete rationality. It would be complete reality. It could accomplish complete communication in its own level, and it would be purely affinity. Descending down the tone scale, greater and greater dissonance could be considered to be introduced into theta. The stream, so to speak, becomes more and more tumultuous, more and more fixed within narrow banks, flowing over heavier rocks and then shoals. As a musical analogy, one could say that the note was becoming less and less a pure and harmonious vibration and was becoming more and more off-key from itself. Descending down the tone scale, affinity, reality, and communication form in themselves a dissonance, one with the other. Also, theta is in more and more tumultuous confusion with Mest. Instead of an orderly and harmonious conquest of Mest by theta, one sees as the tone scale is descended toward death greater and greater turbulence. The sudden impact of theta and Mest together could be considered a turbulence which creates dissonance in theta. This is registered and recorded as pain. Theta and Mest, so impacted together, the characteristics of the theta are changed according to theory and observation, and theta below 2.0 on the tone scale can be considered enturbulated theta, theta which has been confused and chaotically mixed with the material universe, and which will lie in this confusion until death or some other process disenturbulates it. Theta below 2.0 we call n-theta. The mechanism here is a simple one. Mest in a life form is an orderly array above 2.0 on the tone scale. Below 2.0, Mest is considered to be confused and enturbulated and is referred to as n-Mest. We could draw a diagram which would show theta and Mest appearing above 2.0 and n-theta and n-Mest appearing below 2.0. From 2.0 upwards, theta and Mest are more and more orderly mingled until Mest is left behind entirely and theta exists in its pure state. Below 2.0, n-theta and n-Mest are more and more enturbulated in the life form until the point of death and below is reached. We could consider that theta gradually reverses polarity as it descends down the tone scale towards 0.0. We could consider that Mest reverses its polarity when it rises up the tone scale from -3. N-theta has a very repelling effect upon theta and Mest. N-Mest has a repelling effect upon theta and Mest. Below 2.0, Mest and theta are at best turbulently united. Above 2.0, they unite more and more smoothly as they rise up the scale. The Mest more and more under the influence of theta, the theta more and more able to do things with the Mest. Below 2.0, the theta is less and less able to do anything with the Mest. N-theta becomes almost as chaotic as Mest in its pure state. It may occur to someone to ask, what is the difference between Mest and n-Mest if both are without order or plan? The answer is both simple and important. Pure Mest may be said to be virgin chaos, entirely innocent of plan. An organism at tone 4.0 may be said to contain Mest harmoniously planned and organized by theta. But n-Mest is neither of these. It is neither organized nor virginal. it is confused and embroiled with n theta in a twisted, disorganized plan. Here is the mechanism of death, then. N theta and N mest driving out from the organism the remaining theta and mest. This is an important postulate in Dianetics, since from this can be derived the entire tone scale and all the manifestations of human behavior and aberrations. These postulates are what an engineer calls a highly workable truth. For to an engineer, truth is not the absolute of the metaphysician. It is simply something which has a relatively high workability. From the theta-mest theory also may be derived an explanation of faith healing, which is more than an explanation, being a very workable tenet for the auditor. It has been many times noted in the course of man's adventures, in the realm of mental and physical healing, that one individual or another, merely by his presence, or an area, by its sanctity, or the belief of people in it, could accomplish the nearly entire de-aberration of mentally or physically ill human beings. In South America, there is a church outside of which stands a small mountain of crutches, cast away by cripples who became well merely by approaching the altar. And in Bethany some years ago, a man named Lazarus came forth from his tomb. It is an axiom in Dianetics that a sufficient quantity of theta brought into proximity with n theta will disinterbulate the n theta and convert it into theta. This is important enough to form the basic axiom of processing. It explains to the auditor why he cannot take a psychotic who has practically no remaining theta and successfully send that psychotic into the n theta of an engram. The remaining theta of the psychotic would itself merely become interbulated, not being sufficient in quantity, and the psychotic could theoretically become worse. Thus, the second axiom. N theta in sufficient quantity brought into proximity with theta will interbulate that theta. Here we have a matter of quantity. When there is a great deal of theta present, a lesser amount of n theta will disinterbulate and become theta. But when we have more n theta present than theta, the theta is likely to become n theta. This is the contagion factor of aberration. Theta itself could be called reason. N theta could be called unreason. Reason in sufficient quantity brought into the presence of a lesser quantity of unreason will cause reason to prevail. Unreason in sufficient quantity brought into the presence of a lesser quantity of reason will cause that reason to become unreason. Hence, the restimulative character of processing to the auditor. Hence also the various kinds of processing which must be used on various cases. The purer the theta, the more mest will be attracted under it. Theta attempting a conquest of n mest will become in itself interbulated. N theta applied to mest will make it into n mest. N theta will tend and act in the direction of death. N mest tends and acts in the direction of death. Theta tends and acts in the direction of survival, and mest tends and acts in the direction of survival when it has been conquered in an orderly fashion in an organism or by a theta organism. As an example of n theta, consider the thief. A thief is chiefly n theta and prefers n mest to mest. A thief will make n mest out of the mest he steals, which is to say, cloud its title and possibly injure its form or substance. N mest, possessed by theta, has a tendency to interbulate the theta. Thus, an honest man attempting to own a confused and dishonest property will himself become interbulated. A whole series of axioms and optimum conduct codes can be derived from these principles. It is also observable that a high theta volume individual can conquer and handle more mest than a low theta volume individual or an n theta individual. The psychotic, for instance, will ruin any mest he contacts, whereas the highly reasonable man will enhance the mest he contacts. Here also we apparently have some small clue as to what luck is. Mest moves in automatically under good theta. Mest moves out from under n theta. When we speak of affinity, reality, and communication, we are talking about the three component parts of theta. These three quantities in combination, playing upon mest, give us the manifestation we might call computation or understanding. One has to have some affinity for an object, some communication with it, and some concept of its reality before he can understand it. His ability to understand any thought or object depends upon his affinity, his communication, and his reality. All mathematics can be derived from affinity, communication, and reality playing upon MEST. Because affinity, reality, and communication are three component parts of the same thing, namely theta, it would be difficult to increase one component without increasing the other two. The physical universe and what we have called the theta universe are each based upon the principle of survive and succumb. So far as life is concerned, everything above the 2.0 level is survive, and everything below the 2.0 level is succumb. Above the 2.0 level, the organism tends toward life. Below the 2.0 level, the organism tends only toward death. The dynamics could actually be considered as theta applied to various subjects and in different manifestations. Any individual, even an aberree, has occasional moments of functioning as a clear. When he is not restimulated, when his engrams, locks, and secondaries are not forcefully restimulated by his environment, the theta gradually disinterbulates and he becomes possessed of a higher level of reason. Most people reach 3.0 part of the time as a normal course of events. Some people, in rare instances, behave and reason like MEST clears. Hardly anyone has failed to have moments when he approximated the condition of clear. Being clear is a state of being possessed of all available theta, which in an aberree would be partially trapped in engrams and locks. The ordinary person, with his engrams and locks, is rarely in the happy and reasonable state of a release or a clear. The release or clear is in that desirable state rather constantly. But this does not mean that the release or clear are not, in the presence of an overwhelming amount of N-theta in the environment, susceptible to interbulation. For they are. They, however, do not greatly retain the interbulance, and as soon as they are free from such an N-theta environment, they restore immediately to a cleared state. Further, they do not depress very far down the tone scale. This case is very different from that of an individual who has relatively little theta left to interbulate and who in even a mild N-theta environment sinks rapidly down the tone scale. It is a question of resilience and recovery ability, as well as the ability to reason constantly and clearly in most situations. The chart should be read with the understanding that nearly everyone who does not have to be put away in a sanitarium, wholly bereft of his senses, has some available theta. There are many persons possessed of a high volume of theta, but whose aberrations bring them down chronically below the level of 2.0, who can yet function having some theta available. These people interbulate rapidly. There are many people who are not classified as psychotic ordinarily, who demonstrate considerable quantities of theta and who yet on some slight setback interbulate rapidly down to 1.1 or 0.5 on the tone scale, and remain there for some time after the interbulance. These people, rested and not in immediate contact with the restimulative situation, regain some of the theta from the turbulent area. The strength of the dynamics of an individual could be considered to be determined first by the native volume of theta possessed by the individual, and second, by the impeding effect of his engrams as restimulated in the environment. One could then have a very high dynamic individual who yet has been so thoroughly aberrated that on the least setback he would fall rapidly down the tone scale below 2.0. People like this, having high dynamics, attempt naturally to conquer a great deal of MEST, but in the process of conquering it are interbulated by the MEST, the society, and the environment, so that they accumulate enormous quantities of locks. And if such a person has hidden within him many engrams, these will rapidly become charged, and the person will become highly occluded and intensely aberrated, but will yet be able to function sometimes on a creative and constructive level. The system of dynamics is a method of subdividing the theta of an individual to show how much theta he has available in any one sphere of activity. These divisions could be made as follows. First, the dynamic of self, the urge for individual survival, reason toward individual survival for one's self. Second, the dynamic of survival through sex and children. Third, the urge to survive through groups as a member of the group or for the survival of the group itself. Fourth, the urge of the individual to survive for mankind or the urge of all mankind to survive. Fifth, the urge of the individual to survive for life, or of life to survive for itself. Sixth, the urge of the individual to promote the survival of Mest, either for his own benefit or for the benefit of Mest itself, manifested in the preservation of property as such, no matter to whom it belongs. Seventh, the urge of Theta to survive, the urge of the individual to promote the survival of Theta and to survive through the survival of Theta. Eighth, the urge toward survival through the Supreme Being. The number 8 laid on its side gives us the symbol for infinity. Any of these dynamics can be broken down into the 3 component parts of affinity, communication, and reality. On the first dynamic, one has the affinity for self, the concept of the reality of self, and the ability to communicate with memory of self. The second dynamic would concern itself with the affinity for a mate or children for the future of a race, the communication with a mate or children, and a concept of the reality of these. In the third dynamic lies the affinity of the individual for the group or the affinity of the group for itself, the ability of the individual and the group to communicate, the general reality or agreement existing in the group and between the individual and the group. The fourth dynamic, as ARC, would mean the affinity of the individual for all man and of mankind for the individual. It would include the communication of man with man and the reality concepts or agreements of men with mankind. The fifth dynamic would include the affinity of the individual for life or the affinity of life for other life, the ability of life to communicate with life or with the individual, and the concept of agreement and reality of life. The sixth dynamic would include the affinity, communication, and reality of Mest as itself, within its own laws as expressed in the physical sciences. But more important for our purposes, the feeling of the individual for Mest, to know it, to use it, and to preserve it. The seventh dynamic would be that of Theta itself, which is composed in its component parts, according to our postulates, of affinity, reality, and communication. The eighth dynamic would be the dynamic of the Supreme Being or the Creator. That would be God. One could consider that God created the physical universe and the Theta universe. Chapter 7, Column F, Emotion. Emotion could be called the energy manifestation of affinity. They are listed in 2 columns because emotion may be treated as a subdivision of the more general subject of affinity. Emotion is not synonymous with life energy, but is evidently only a part of one of the points of the triangle of affinity, communication, and reality. Emotion, however, furnishes an obvious index to the psychic state and is the quantity most easily observed by the auditor. As used in Dianetics, emotion could be called the index of the state of being. The development of a new science naturally means the development of many new terms, and as new data is discovered, old definitions are often found to be inadequate. Thus it is with emotion. In the English language, emotional is often considered synonymous with irrational. One often hears the statement, "Don't be so emotional, be reasonable." This would seem to assume that if one is emotional, one cannot be reasonable. No more unreasonable assumption could possibly be made. Engrams have, each one of them, their own emotional tones, just as each engram has a somatic. This is a false emotional tone, which is foisted upon the aberree in lieu of the natural and reasonable emotion. Because emotion has a strong manifestation, and because the less desirable kinds of emotion are displayed by people in highly tense states, emotion has been clouded as a desirable quantity. A fully reasonable human being displays the emotion called for rationally by the circumstances with which he is confronted in present time. Thus, if the present time circumstance requires grief, a rational and reasonable person is apt to display grief. If the present time situation demands anger, the rational human being will display anger. Irrational emotion could manifest itself irrationally for any given situation. If the present time circumstances required grief and yet the individual displayed no grief, this would be irrational. If the present time situation seemed to indicate, because of happy circumstances, happiness, and yet the individual remained apathetic, this would be irrational. Emotion, then, is neither rational nor irrational, except as it is displayed. An aberrated person seldom displays the type of emotion rationally called for by any given circumstance. To describe this, we would actually need a new word, perhaps misemotional. Such a word would indicate that a person did not display the emotion called for by the actual circumstances of the situation. This would indicate that his aberrated condition caused him to display an emotional reaction inappropriate to the present time situation. Being misemotional would then be synonymous with being irrational. Being emotional, however, would indicate, if the emotionality agreed with current circumstances, a rational state of being. One can fairly judge the rationality of any individual by the correctness of the emotion he displays in a given set of circumstances. To be joyful and happy when circumstances call for joy and happiness would be rational. To display grief without sufficient present-time cause would be irrational. Engrams and the generally aberrated state of a being generally deny emotion. Happiness and cheerfulness being the very trademark of survival, one could expect with considerable justification that as an individual became more and more aberrated, he would be less and less able to be happy. Such is the case. From happiness at the top, down the dwindling spiral through anger, grief, and apathy, to no reaction whatsoever, would run not only emotion but the life potential of the individual. And thus we have a direct index of measurement of the aberrated state of the person. One must remember that even a very aberrated person, in relatively uninturbulated present-time moments, has considerable free theta. The fact that a person interpolates readily, for instance to the 1.1 level, and thus reacts along that level, does not mean that every waking moment finds him reacting on such a level. Until he is entirely psychotic because of present-time interpolation, he quite ordinarily demonstrates a great deal of free theta. The danger of his condition does not lie in the fact that he is always psychotic. It lies in the fact that when he becomes interpolated, his existing free theta, which itself is capable of happiness and reason, will interpolate down the tone scale to 1.1. As this individual lives longer and becomes more aberrated, when a trying situation confronts him, a situation which interpolates his free theta, he will drop not only to the 1.1 level, but below that to the 0.5 level. Once the dwindling spiral has set in, from year to year, the environment of the aberree remaining more or less unchanged, he can be expected, when interpolated, to drop lower and lower on the tone scale. Dianetics can interrupt this dwindling spiral. It can restore free theta to the mind. It can erase the traps which wait for the individual when his free theta is interpolated. Thus, a person who has a Dianetic release or a messed clear is extremely resilient. Trying present-time circumstances do not form heavy locks. He has no irrational reasons to experience grief or fear. But when present-time circumstances strongly call for these emotions, he will display them and yet soon afterward be fully recovered. The only thing which can interpolate his theta and cause him to drop any distance down the tone scale momentarily is some circumstance in the immediate environment strong enough to influence and affect him. A person who has been freed of engrams, secondaries, and locks should not be expected to remain in a state of idiotic cheerfulness in the face of any and all circumstances. This in itself would be a very aberrated type of conduct. There are certain manic individuals who do this, and they unfortunately are quite insane. One of the primary things which Dianetic processing does is free the emotions of the individual so that he can experience emotion ranging from happiness, eagerness, and exhilaration down to anger, fear, and grief, when these emotions are called for by present-time circumstances. Emotion is a primary index of the tone scale. This does not mean that emotion is all there is to theta. Emotion is used as a primary clue to the auditor of the pre-clear's position on the tone scale because it is so easily recognized. The two gradient systems, however, on the margin of the chart, one from 0 to 1000 and the other from -3 to 40.0, are both arbitrary number systems. The 0 to 1000 scale exists so that psychometric percentiles can be computed on the chart. The -3 to 40.0 scale is the original tone scale of Dianetics. This original scale is preserved because it is handy for the auditor to use and is a basic part of Dianetic terminology. One quite commonly hears auditors speaking of a 1.5 case, meaning a case in chronic anger or one which interbulates easily into anger. Or one may hear an auditor speak of a 2.5 case, which tells his indoctrinated listener that this case is rather bored with the whole thing, but is fairly well advanced and comes up easily to what is known as false 4. The tone scale is not a derived scale, but one which has been constructed after observation of many preclears. An auditor can very easily observe this. Suppose he discovers his preclear to be in an anger tone as he runs an incident. The auditor can expect that the anger will generally, on one recounting, abate, and on the second recounting that the preclear will begin to express resentment. On the third recounting, or fourth or fifth, the preclear may come to boredom, then to indifference, and, on subsequent recountings, rise up to perfect cheerfulness about the incident. If the auditor were to discover an incident where the preclear was in the deepest apathy, the tone of the preclear would be seen to rise during auditing through the whole span of the tone scale, step by step. First, the preclear would be in very deep apathy, not knowing or caring whether this incident would resolve or not. He would then go up the scale to apathy, then to grief. He would express some fear and apprehension. He would become sullen. Finally, he would become angry. Then he would express resentment and, through boredom, would gradually rise up to false 4. Not all incidents, of course, find the preclear going up the scale step by step. He follows exactly the same scale, but he may skip or omit various stages of the emotion. Thus, starting an incident at grief, the preclear may come to boredom and thus to complete carelessness about the incident. Thus, the tone scale is based upon observation. It is a very valuable index to the state of an engram. If the preclear enters the engram in anger, is made angry by it, that is, the auditor knows that the incident will be relatively easy to run on up the line. But if the preclear is found to be in very deep apathy, the auditor knows that he has a long way to travel with this incident before he can bring the preclear entirely out of it up the tone scale. Finding the preclear in a deep apathy in an incident should alert the auditor to the fact that he must handle this situation with the greatest care, that he must request subsequent recountings very gently, so that the apathy will gradually rise, with repeated recountings of the incident, up to grief, so that the grief can release and so bring the preclear up to the top of the scale concerning this incident. The emotional tone scale introduces something else as an auditor's tool. When the auditor discovers he cannot run grief out of a case, he should examine the preclear's bank a little more carefully to discover what emotional tone he can turn on in the preclear, since he can turn on at least one emotional tone. If he cannot turn on grief, he may be able to turn on anger. And once he has taken some of the anger off of the case, perhaps he can run some of the lower levels such as fear. Having run several incidents which have fear in them, the auditor may discover that he can run grief off the case. Sometimes a case will fall so easily into an apathy that the auditor has to be very alert in order to unburden some of the higher level emotions before he attempts to run the incidents of deepest apathy which he finds in the case. As a working rule, an auditor can always find some emotional tone to run on a case. He should make it his business to discover what emotional tone is easiest to run on the case and run some incidents of that tone. Naturally, although it does considerable good to run happy incidents on a case, thus raising the preclear's tone, a new turbulence is likely to suppress the preclear down into his original state. However, there have been instances when merely running happy incidents on a case recovered sufficient theta from the lower strata of tones of the scale that sufficient attention units were recovered to turn on sonic and visio. This trick of running pleasure moments is easily the best way to get a preclear up to present time. One runs the pleasure moment just as though it were an engram, and the attention of the preclear can be attracted to this incident so strongly that attention units are recovered. Emotion is an integral part of every engram, but it will stand by itself in what is called a secondary engram. There are actually 3 kinds of secondary engrams. 1. Affinity break or enforcement engrams. 2. Reality break or enforcement engrams. 3. Communication break or enforcement engrams. These are called secondary engrams because they do not contain physical pain, but depend for their permanence on a physical pain engram earlier in the bank. Thus, the words secondary engram mean a highly charged moment in the analytical mind of the pre-clear, which depends for its force on a physical pain engram lower in the bank. In running secondary engrams or painful emotion, the auditor must develop considerable skill. One cannot, for instance, bluntly demand grief, nor can one bluntly demand fear. Considerable skill and tact are required to contact the necessary incident to resolve the case. It is a working rule of the auditor that a case must be always unburdened of some emotion. Only cases in a very high range of the tone scale can have physical pain engrams run on them without running some secondary engrams. If one could run off from a case all painful emotion, all expressed resentment, anger, fear, grief, and apathy, one would have a Dianetic release whether he touched physical pain engrams or not. This is theoretically true, but practically almost impossible, since when he starts to run various secondary engrams, the auditor will often find the case sliding back into the supporting physical pain engram, which must then be run. Running the painful emotion off a case produces the most signal improvements that are obtained in Dianetic processing. Chapter 8, Column G, Affinity. In view of the fact that the word love has at least two outstanding meanings in the English language, a misunderstanding could result if it were employed to represent this factor in theta. Affinity is a broad term and means simply a sympathy of feeling, an affection, the feeling of one person for another as we use it in Dianetics. Affinity in the theta sense, Dianetically, might be compared to cohesion and adhesion in the physical universe as applied to energy. There are degrees of affinity according to our definition as represented by the tone scale. These range from a feeling of well-being along all the dynamics down the various stages of emotion to severance of feeling from any and all of the dynamics. Affinity broadly includes emotion. The tone scale of affinity, as represented on the chart, refers to the reaction of the individual at any particular time to just one or to a small number of people. But as affinity is suppressed repeatedly, the individual will begin to take on a habitual level on the affinity scale, a habitual reaction to almost all people. This is also true of the affinity scale of groups, and one can find on this scale the tone level of any nation, or indeed of mankind, for any given period, which would be the averaging out of the general reaction of mankind to mankind. At the top of the scale, around tone 4.0, the individual experiences love, strong and outgoing. He experiences friendliness. This is an extroversion of affinity. One commonly finds this in children, who then growing older and receiving rejections and rebuffs, first from one or two people and then from many, will gradually experience the blunting of their affinity. Around tone 3.0, we have the individual experiencing tolerance without much outgoing action. The individual at this level will accept advances offered, but does not readily make such advances himself. Around 2.5, the individual begins to neglect persons or people in general. He may even dislike them as a general rule and attempt to get away from them. At the level of tone 2.0, the affinity is expressed as antagonism, a feeling of annoyance and irritation caused by the advances of other people toward the individual. Love is received with suspicion. It is seriously questioned and may gain as its return distaste. Around 1.5, affinity has almost reversed itself. Its dissonance has become hate, which can be violent and is so expressed. Love offered to such a person may excite him into violent acts of repulsion. Here actually we have a factor of n theta repelling theta, since theta itself contains as one of its components love. Around 1.1 we reach the level of covert hostility. Here the hatred of the individual has been socially and individually censured to a point where it has been suppressed, and the individual no longer dares demonstrate hate as such. He yet possesses sufficient energy to express some feeling on the matter, and so what hatred he feels comes forth covertly. All manner of subterfuges may be resorted to. The person may claim to love others and to have the good of others as his foremost interest, yet at the same moment he works, unconsciously or otherwise, to injure or destroy the lives and reputations of people and to also destroy property. Below 1.0, we reach fear, which is expressed on its highest level as acute shyness, stage fright, extreme modesty, being tongue-tied among other people, being easily frightened by proffered affection. Here also we reach the strange manifestation of the individual attempting to buy off the imagined danger by propitiation. We have an interesting example of this in processing. Cases which are far down on the tone scale will, when they reach 1.0, quite commonly offer the auditor presents and attempt to do things for him. A crude description of this was once contained in the idea of transference. At this level, we have withdrawal from people. At 0.5, we reach the level of grief, wherein we have supplications by the individual, his pleas for pity, his desperate efforts to win support by tears. We may even have at this level extremely strange perversions of truth intended to achieve the pity and support of others. For instance, the rejected sweetheart, reaching this level of grief, may invent all manner of odd and peculiar incidents of cruelty on the part of the past lover in order to win the sympathy of those around her. Sinking below grief, one reaches apathy, wherein affinity is expressed by complete withdrawal from person or people. There is in apathy no real attempt to contact one's self, and no attempt to contact others. Here we have a null point of dissonance, which is on the threshold of death. The auditor has a handy measuring stick with the affinity scale, since he can, by observing the pre-clear, establish the pre-clear's attitude toward people or groups and discover the position of the pre-clear on the chart. Further, by watching the relations of the pre-clear with others improve, he can see the gradual rise in tone of the case. Chapter 9. Communication and Reality. The overall subject of communication covers far more than the exchange of intelligence. Basically, communication could be called the science of perceptions. As general semantics is organized on the subject of words and ideas, so can be organized and so has been organized in Dianetics the entire subject of perception. Everything which we know of the physical universe, and possibly anything which we can know of the theta universe, allowing that it exists, could be said to be embraced by perception, computation, and imagination. By perception, we mean the perceiving of entities or existences. We achieve what we know of reality by perceiving entities and existences in the physical universe and possibly the theta universe by combining these perceptions and computing or imagining results not in disagreement with the results obtained by others. The channels of our perception of the physical universe are 26 in number. The most important of these are sonic, visio, tactile, olfactory, kinesthesia, thermal, joint position, body position, moisture, organic perceptions, and, adding one more discovered in Dianetics, perception of movement on the time track. It is with these that the auditor most vitally concerns himself, as it is through these that we learn the most of the physical universe. With sonic we perceive, by mental mechanism, the sound waves of the physical universe, and, by comparison and experience, both genetic and environmental, interpret them. With visio, we perceive light waves which, as sight, are compared with experience and evaluated. By tactile, we perceive the shape and texture of surfaces and compounds. With olfactory perception, we perceive the minute particles of matter which register as smell. By kinesthesia, we perceive motion through space and time. By thermal, we perceive temperature, hotness, and coldness, and so can evaluate further our current environment by comparing it to past environments. By perceiving joint position, we can measure space and the size of objects and know more about our physical situation. By perceiving body position, we sense our relationship with our immediate environment. Moisture perception permits us to sense the dampness or dryness of the atmosphere and so judge further our environment. Through organic perceptions, we perceive the states of our own bodies internally. These and other sense messages combine to make up a body of experience. Just how much of this experience is genetic and how much of it is carried in the theta body, if that exists, we cannot at this time accurately measure. In our environment, however, by these various sense channels, we gain experience and can act in the present time environment or plan for the future. It might be said that we have, potentially, a sensory reception mechanism for every type of sense message which can be radiated or delivered to us by the physical universe and from the theta universe. Thus, we have hearing because there are sound waves which can be registered and interpreted. We have sight because light waves exist to be registered, and so forth. A very interesting paper could be prepared upon the probable evolution of our senses. Theta, combining with Mest to make life, reaches out in its conquest of Mest via the sense perceptions to exist within and control the environment and to some degree regulate the future, and particularly in man, to adjust the environment to the organism, the species, or the race. Just what theta universe perceptics are is a subject at this time so diffuse that one cannot even be sure there is a theta universe. Such manifestations as extrasensory perception, intuition, clairvoyance, clairaudience, and others make up a body of quasi-knowledge which is normally relegated to the field of psychic phenomena. The existence of God and spiritual manifestations could be classified as theta universe. Contact with these would be considered a use of theta perceptics. Oddly enough, in Dianetics, considerable evidence, whether we wish it or not, is accumulating in favor of not only a theta universe and a theta body, but of theta perceptics as well. This has proceeded far enough to contain some evidence that certain techniques of application, already partially formed, exist by which the theta perceptics can be cleared, raising the prediction potentiality of the individual, among other things. Judging solely on the evidence at hand, one would say that more evidence existed in favor of the theta universe, the theta body, and theta perceptics than existed to deny them. This evidence has accumulated to a sufficient extent to cast extreme doubt on the scientific postulate that all man would ever know was the physical universe. Indeed, science was unable to resolve mental problems and forecast behavior and invent better human technologies so long as it assumed that life and man rose from compounds and clay of the physical universe with no other ingredient. This line of reasoning led to no advances in technology and, indeed, permitted the physical sciences to outstrip all knowledge of human behavior. This would seem more or less inevitable, however, if one considered that the primary mission of theta was to conquer the physical universe, at least insofar as the branch of theta which is ourselves is currently concerned. With such a mission, the physical universe would of course become the best-known sphere of reality. Perhaps theta is now in a position where it can understand more of itself. By this, one does not urge upon the reader that Dianetics concerns itself vitally at this time with psychic phenomena, but it is mentioned in passing that, in the course of investigation, data continues to accumulate against the idea that man is a creature of the physical universe alone. The auditor, working case after case, cannot but run upon evidence strongly in favor of a relatively timeless theta body, existing as a personal identity, running parallel to the genetic line of species. And if he ignores this, he may bog down some of his cases. Specifically, I refer to the continuing and growing volume of reports from auditors on the subject of past deaths and past lives. This subject needs to be warily and thoroughly examined, but it remains that the auditor who runs into a past death and does not reduce it properly by standard procedure will find his case thoroughly bogged down. And indeed, some cases cannot be run and will not move on the time track until these factors are taken into consideration. Some of this data has been known for 2 years, but a diffidence to comment upon it until the evidence was overwhelming has suppressed and continues to suppress the knowledge. As it develops, Dianetics more and more seems potentially able eventually to contact the often postulated but never thoroughly sensed, measured, and experienced human soul. The subject of past deaths and past lives is so full of tension that as early as July 1950, the Board of Trustees of the Foundation sought to pass a resolution banning the entire subject, and I have been many times requested to omit any reference to these in the present work or in public for fear that a general impression would get out that Dianetics had something to do with spiritualism. Further, The view has been many times expressed that in view of the fact that prenatals are so controversial, the introduction of past lives and past deaths into Dianetics, even as an experimental investigation, would permit old schools of therapy to persist in their delusion that all is delusion. This would hardly be a scientific way of handling a science. A true scientist boldly and fearlessly reports that which he finds. A famous writer told me a short time ago a story about Thomas Carlyle, who, upon hearing that an American lady writer named Margaret Fuller had said, "I accept the universe," said only, "By God, she'd better." The auditor who runs his pre-clear down the track and suddenly finds the pre-clear possessed of strong somatics and a visio of AD 1210 scenery had better reduce the incident as an engram. Failing to get a proper reduction, the auditor had better ask for the incident necessary to resolve this weird manifestation. If the auditor is dull indeed, he will invalidate the incident to the pre-clear and pass up running it, at which point his pre-clear will bog down. There are evidently three kinds of these experiences. 1. Those which are dub-in and which occur only in cases which dub-in the present life. 2. Fantasies built upon reading and imagination but without somatics. And 3. What seem to be valid and real experiences. If this data of past lives and past deaths in the theta body continues to stand up and become susceptible to exacting proof, it certainly threatens to radically alter our culture. At the present time, all we can do is gather evidence. The Foundation would be glad to have any and all such evidence which auditors may discover and care to submit. Never invalidate a past life or a past death, and never fail to run such somatics as actual experiences. Failure to observe this enjoinder may seriously harm the case. I have given you this information because I do not believe that helping the auditor to audit and helping cases to run can seriously hurt Dianetics. To unburden a case to the point where the individual is messed clear, it is only necessary to work with the avenues of perception to the physical universe. What we conceive to be reality is actually agreed-upon perception of the physical universe. There is an endless philosophic wrangle as to whether or not our perceptions perceive anything or whether or not our perceptions are merely an illusion themselves. True enough, the physical universe can be reduced down to a zero mathematically. Matter, energy, space, and time could be said to be the result of certain motions. The moment we go off into the byroad of wondering whether the physical universe is real or not, we come rapidly upon many philosophic imponderables. What we know as reality, however, is an agreed-upon conception of the physical universe in which we live. You and I agree that a table exists in the center of the room. We can see it and feel it, and when we rap it with our knuckles, we can hear that something is there. You and I have agreed upon the reality of the table mainly because each of us agrees that he perceives it via his senses. Should someone come up and say that not a table but a black cat stood there, you and I would consider the man mad. Indeed, by a sort of natural selection, we remove such madnesses from our society. When someone is in disagreement with the majority as to the sense perceptions of the physical universe, the first reaction of the majority is to have this person pronounced mad and locked up. Locked up, he does not procreate and so breaks the genetic line. This happens often enough to select out of the human race those who do not agree on the nature of the physical universe via sense perceptions. Many amusing and entertaining postulates can be formed on the subject of reality. Certain it is that by communication, by the group of sense perceptions which make up communication, we know reality. Our affinity with that reality, our admission that we are a part of that reality, and our acceptance of our participation in it is necessary to our communication with it. And thus we have the triangle of Dianetics: affinity, reality, and communication. One cannot stand without the other two. There cannot, for instance, be communication and affinity alone. These two things would result in an agreement of some sort, which agreement would be a reality. If communication exists, some agreement can be reached. And as soon as an agreement is reached between two people or by a man with himself, there is some affinity. If affinity and reality exist, then a communication must ensue or must already exist in order to act as a channel of expression and recognition of the agreement. An auditor knowing the trio, affinity, reality, and communication, can use any point of the triangle as a point of attack in order to enhance the other two corners of the triangle. The overall subject of communication, as we have seen, contains all avenues of sense perception: sonic, visio, tactile, olfactory, and the rest. It includes as well the perception of too strong a contact with the messed universe, pain, which is itself less directly a form of communication. The receipt of perceptions of the real universe and the purpose of theta come about as computation. Computation creates ideas concerning reality, and this creation of ideas leads to the type of communication which is commonly and ordinarily classified as communication, conversation, messages, and other methods of exchange of ideas. The auditor must appreciate the value of communication, since if his preclear cannot communicate with his own past, he cannot make an accurate adjudication of his own present, and he certainly cannot compute his own future. When a man is unable to contact the reality of the present or appreciate it, and when he cannot compute his own future and act upon that computation, that person is considered in varying degrees neurotic or psychotic. The auditor, then, does well who knows this subject thoroughly. Chapter 10. Column H. Sonic. By the word sonic in Dianetics is meant sonic recall rather than hearing sounds outside the body. Sonic means hearing the sounds which have been remembered. Those sounds which the individual has heard in the past are all recorded either in the Analytical Standard Memory Bank or in the Reactive Bank. Those which are recorded in the Analytical Standard Memory Bank are all available to the recall mechanisms of the individual, to his I. Those which have been recorded in the Reactive Bank have been received by the individual while he was unconscious, in a hypnotic state, while drugged, while delirious, while unconscious from a severe injury, or even while unconscious momentarily because of a light injury. Such perceptics as sonic were not thought before Dianetics to be recorded at all during a period of unconsciousness. One of the basic discoveries of Dianetics was that these perceptics were recorded during periods of unconsciousness of an individual, and that this material was available for recovery, and that this material so received and so recorded had an aberrative effect on the individual. Whether the sound has been heard while the person was awake or asleep or unconscious, that sound is available to the recall mechanism of I. The fantastic storage capacity of the mind has no structural explanation at this time, but every sound, whether a voice, an auto horn, the click of tableware, footsteps, the wind, every sound which the individual has heard in his lifetime is recorded. Thus recorded, it is available to the I of the individual. Dianetic technique sends the individual back through his life and, by the perceptics of sonic, visio, and so forth, enables him to recover information which has been occluded from him. There are very many gradations of the quality of sonic. A case on which there is much grief and other types of charge may or may not have sonic recall. A case which is generally occluded from one end of the track to the other may be so occluded by charge, valence trouble, sonic command shutoffs, or being stuck out of present time that it has no sonic at all. This condition may be so bad that it renders the individual unable to remember anything that has been said, even shortly after it has been uttered, as well as back along the time track. The charge, valence troubles, and command shutoffs of sonic may be relatively light, under which circumstances the individual will receive what are known as sonic impressions. He can get impressions of the voice tones in which the words are being uttered as he travels along the track, but he does not hear the sounds clearly. The case may have, however, so little sonic shutoff, valence trouble, and charge that clear sonic, just as it was heard in the first place, is available as the person travels on the time track as well as in near-present time. Sonic shutoff may be quite selective. The individual may be able to hear sounds but not voices. He may be able to hear an entire symphony orchestra and yet be unable to hear again what his wife asked him to bring home for dinner. Selective shutoffs are caused both by charge on the case and by selective sonic shutoff commands, such as, "You cannot hear your wife," or You pay no attention to me. A primary concern of the auditor is the turning on of sonic. Therefore, he must know what turns it off. According to present theory, which works out relatively well in practice, the most severe source of sonic shutoff is being stuck on the track. In that the individual cannot move on the track, he cannot, of course, move through incidents and hear them. The next most severe interference with sonic comes from valence shifters. The person's identity is confused with that of another person. He is not in his own valence, and he is off his own time track. The next most severe source of sonic shutoff is the command phrase, which says specifically, "You can't hear anything. You never listen to a word I say. You have to keep still. I'm as deaf as a post," etc., etc. Sonic is additionally affected somewhat by grief and charge on the case, but not as much as might be expected, since cases which have enormous grief and charge on them, in general, yet retain sonic recall in the absence of valence shifters. The most severe sonic shutoff would be that caused by a combination of factors which would include not only being stuck on the track in an engram, but also having the track itself collapsed by groupers which are active. There are cases which have fake sonic dub-in. According to theory, this dub-in is caused by demon circuits, which is to say, heavily charged portions of the analytical mind which have been captured by the reactive mind and do its bidding, walled off by charge into separate entities. These are very easy to spot, however, since dub-in sonic usually is inane and does not make sense. Furthermore, when the individual with dub-in has gone through an incident once, he cannot return through the incident with the same words. One should not regard a dub-in recall case as something hard to detect. It is very simple, even for the beginner, to detect dub-in, since it will not repeat or bear repetition, but alters markedly, and it is not particularly sensible, and it does not run at all like an engram. The dub-in sonic case, after it has been worked for a short time, can be expected to lose the dub-in. Once the circuit causing it is contacted, a non-sonic case results. This should not be confused with the case which has sonic, but which has experienced severe auditor breaks of the auditor's code, has had engrams run partially but not reduced, and has had groupers triggered so that the time track is collapsed. The way to differentiate these is that the case which had dub-in that has turned off will still run as easily and ably on the time track as formerly. From a non-sonic condition, as valence shifters and sonic shutoff commands are run out of the case, sonic impressions will become available, and then sonic itself should return. The subject of sonic recall is one which requires an enormous amount of study before final adjudication can be made by anyone as to its total ramifications. Experience in Dianetics has demonstrated that recalls in general are very fully recovered by the clear, and this is true of sonic. As may be seen on the chart, the gradient scale of sonic does not show it to be a phenomenon by which the position of the pre-clear on the chart may be established, save only in the broadest sense. The clear at the top of the scale has, ordinarily, full sonic recall. But such may have been his aberrated condition that over large areas of the track his analytical memory bank has received no adequate or sharp recordings. From the moment a person is clear or nearly clear, on forward in his life, he will have sonic recall. During his period of aberration, however, he may not have registered sounds here and there on the track. There is much misunderstanding about sonic and visio recalls in the state of clear. These recalls are not eidetic in all cases, as photographic or phonographic recall are a matter of training, and a person not trained into them will not necessarily register sights and sounds with sufficient concentration to have all the material available for immediate recall. A very large number of tests must be undertaken on the whole subject of recalls, and a great number of cases must be observed before we can clearly and scientifically evaluate recall potentials in every individual when cleared. The recalls, however, are good in those cases so far observed, but are not necessarily eidetic. A person may have sonic recall of an accurate nature at any place on the tone scale, providing the person can move freely on the track and is in valence. Ability to recall in sonic is not an index of neurosis or psychosis. Sonic recall is affected by factors which in themselves are not such an index. The amount of free theta available for analytical perception and computation is itself actually the only index. However, in the lower portions of the tone scale, one ordinarily expects the reasonable person not to have sonic recall or any other recall, and one expects the true psychotic or neurotic individual to have sonic recall. This has misled practitioners of the healing arts in the past to believe that sonic recall was only to be found in idiots and morons, an entire falsity based on limited observation. The influencing mechanism on sonic recall is whether or not the mind has sufficient power, structurally most likely, to cut off and wall up charge and the general results of engrams and still reserve a portion of the analyzer for free thought with the remaining free theta. The psychotic or neurotic individual does not have the power to reserve, for clear thinking, some portion of the analyzer, and so, when interbulated by engrams, but still in valence, becomes analytically completely and wholly interbulated, with no reserved portion of the analyzer not subject to that interbulation. Where a person has a psychosomatic illness and sonic recall, one should expect to find a near psychotic individual, the psychosomatic illnesses telling of many engrams and the sonic recall stating that the analyzer has not the power to wall up unhappy and painful memories. Where one finds psychosomatic illnesses and a sonic shutoff, one may find a person who is potentially low on the tone scale, but who yet has enough free theta to respond on a high analytical level, and yet who may perform in life in a very aberrated fashion for all this. The thinking on this subject in the past has been entirely too short. The observation has been, in past schools, that a great deal of aberration meant a great deal of thrust and drive, and, therefore, that an individual who was neurotic could be expected to perform in the arts and in other directions more ably than a person who was sane. This, by derivation and observation and much experience, is an outright fallacy. The individual with a great deal of free theta is apt to be more robust than his fellows. He may or may not have more engrams, but he tries from his earliest days to take in more area than his fellows and to adjust his environment to him rather than follow the sheep-like course of trying to adjust himself to the environment. He is therefore continually rebuffed, and his engrams will gradually charge up by the process of affinity, reality, and communication breaks until he responds rather neurotically to his environment. Such a person is normally rather thoroughly shut off so far as sonic and visio are concerned. His theta, what is left of it in a free state, operating in what small portion of his analyzer is still available, is still greater than the theta available to the average human being. When we take this individual and dianetically process him and turn the n-theta into theta, he becomes more and more powerful and able to cope with and adjust his environment. He will not have sonic and visio until he reaches a released or a cleared state. Such individuals are difficult to process only because the mind has so expertly walled itself in from the charge on the case. However, such an individual is very worthwhile to process, since when the auditor has finished, or even if the auditor never does finish, one has left a strong creative asset to the society. The auditor who, because they seem easy, works near psychotic or psychotic cases which have sonic, may have, when he is through, an individual who, no matter if structurally intelligent, is yet possessed of so little theta that his worth to the society is small. These conclusions are highly generalized, but have been borne out in a large number of cases. Cases exist in which the individual is so unaberrated that, though he is endowed with enough free theta to make him a tremendous asset to the society, he still has sonic and visio, being already at the 3.5 range on the tone scale. It is far from true that a person to be of worth to the society must be highly aberrated and must have his recalls cut off, since in such an aberrated state he is likely to be so low on the tone scale that his positive worth to the society, which would be realized were he at 3.0 on the tone scale or above, becomes a liability, and his aberrations violently affect his environment and bring about its destruction. Such persons are the dictators who lead their countries to ruin through war, the artists who through their grossness and vulgarity destroy the mores of a race and so destroy the race. What the auditor should know principally about sonic recall is that it makes a case easier to run and that a case without it, properly processed, will eventually pick it up. The auditor should never despair of sonic recall shutoff cases. Impressions will get stronger and sonic recall will eventually turn on. But the individual has to be very high on the tone scale before he regains sonic if he began with complete shutoffs. Further, there is a technique which sometimes turns on sonic, known as running pleasure moments. Pleasure moments can be run on a case just as the auditor runs engrams, going through the moment over and over again. Attention units are attracted to the pleasure moment, since it is one of the missions of the mind to attain happiness and pleasure along the various dynamics. By returning the pre-clear to a moment of pleasure and running that moment, the auditor will be able to regain a few attention units out of areas of turbulence. This will make it a little easier for the pre-clear to move on the track, and in so moving, he may pick up sonic recall. In any event, the running of pleasure moments is highly beneficial to a case. The running of future pleasure moments sometimes tunes up the perceptics. These are actually imaginary incidents, so far as can be told. The tone of the individual goes up when running moments of pleasure, and so when moments of pleasure existing in the past are run, or when moments of pleasure in the future are imagined, the tone of any individual may be expected to rise. Affinity breaks often depress sonic, so that a pre-clear who has sonic on Monday and a quarrel with his sweetheart on Tuesday may be found to have much less sonic recall on Wednesday. Further, when the sonic recall of an individual is invalidated, his reality is depressed, so the recall reduces. ARC locks and secondaries markedly influence sonic or any other type of recall. Heightened affinity, reality, and communication may by themselves turn on sonic. Chapter 11, Column I, Visio. Recalling a scene by seeing it again is called in Dianetics visio, by which is meant visual recall. There are two kinds of visio which the individual may encounter. One is imaginary visio, by which is meant the scenery which the imagination constructs. The other is actual visio, by which is meant recall of actual and authentic scenes. In Dianetic terminology, visio usually means valid recall of past scenes. The word dub-in is used to characterize visio which is imaginary. Visio may occur in present time of past scenes, which would be the process of visually remembering. Or it may occur as the pre-clear is returned on the track, seeing again in recall scenes which he has recorded in his past. Dub-in visio may work in much the same way. Possibly the most exact borderline between sanity and insanity would be that between knowing that one was imagining what had happened and not knowing that one was imagining. All recalls can become short-circuited through the imagination so that the eye is led to believe that it is recalling an actuality when really it is having furnished to it from the memory banks an imaginary sequence. When ARC is very low on a case, usually below the 2.0 range, the condition obtains with the case that many of his recalls, no matter how authentic I considers them, are imaginary. As an example of this, consider the person in an anger state who is recounting a conversation or a quarrel he has had. People who are angry almost never tell the truth. People who have sunk to the covert hostility range become so confused between reality and imagination that even their small talk is utterly untrustworthy. And yet these people may believe they are telling the truth. This is a case of recall being short-circuited through the imagination and I being furnished imaginary data which is yet labeled as authentic data. Possibly the most flagrant breach of truth occurs in the apathy range or slightly above it, where fear mingled with grief can cause the wildest perversion of recall. The best example of dub-in visio would be the scenery which the pre-clear gets when he is returned on the track into the prenatal area. He may get very clear and active but exteriorized pictures of the scenery around his mother, which views and scenes are entirely false and are not to be attributed by the auditor to extrasensory perception. They denote a 1.3 to 1.0 position on the tone scale. Circuitry, about which much will be said later, is the cause of this visio. When the case has been unburdened of many secondary engrams, this visio will cease and the actual visio of the prenatal will take its place. Actual prenatal Visio, of course, is black, except at such times when a light may be entered into the area for surgical purposes, at which times the light is sometimes recorded. A person who is found to be on the tone scale between 1.5 and 0.5 should not be expected to have accurate Visio or any Visio at all, as in the occluded case. Visio and all other recalls follow the same pattern as sonic, and in considering any recall, the data which is given on sonic may be used interchangeably. In the 4.0 range, the individual, when in present time, sees what he remembers, and when returned on the track gets accurate and clear pictures of the scenery, just as he saw it when he was looking at it. He is inside himself, which is to say in valence, and does not get a view of himself as a part of the scenery. This condition normally obtains down to the 3.0 band. Here we begin to get occlusions and exteriorizations in areas which contain highly charged engrams, which themselves contain command phrases that shift the person out of his own valence, such as, "I can't be myself around you," etc. Around 3.0, the person is in most cases on the track. He can get Visio on pleasure moments, and he is able to be inside himself, except when in secondary engrams. Around 2.5, the occlusion becomes marked. Large areas of the track may be missing because of charge and valence shifter engrams. From 4.0 down to 2.0, it is relatively easy to run out occluded areas and discharge secondaries so that Visio returns easily. Below 2.0, the auditor begins to get into trouble and must use a great deal of patience with his preclear because the Visio may be either absent or exteriorized. The auditor, when working such a case, should be very careful at all times never to call any of these oddities to the preclear's attention, as this would be an invalidation of the preclear and would do him much damage. The trouble with the preclear from 2.5 down is that life has invalidated him too often. When the auditor, who is attempting to maintain high ARC with the preclear, seems to rank himself with those factors in life which have already suppressed and hurt the preclear, what little Visio has survived may very easily fold up, so that the auditor causes himself a great deal of work in rehabilitating the ARC and getting the Visio or other recalls back. Around the anger band, we begin to enter the potentially psychotic area. This does not mean that a person who is at 2.0 is a psychotic. It means that when the free theta of the individual enturbulates momentarily, he finds himself easily along the 2.0 band, and that he conducts himself generally in his reactions toward life along this band. It is possible for a case to be in valence all the way down the track and to get good moving Visios and still be in the 2.0, 1.5, 1.1 band and be thoroughly psychotic. Here again we have an individual whose structural mechanisms are insufficient to bar out existing charge on the case. Thus the person's theta is continually and entirely enturbulated, having no free portion of the analyzer in which to operate. His theta is always under the influence of the charge on the case, because he has made for it no protecting partitions. By partition, compartmentation, and occlusion are not meant valence walls. These are something else. The valence wall can actually exist in the individual to a point where he can be either one of two persons, himself and another person. In the very highly charged case, in the case of the obvious psychotic, these valence walls are so well defined that the auditor can almost watch the person click from one valence to another. The schizophrenic of psychiatry, the person who shifts from one identity to another, in Dianetics we call a valence case. And when these valence walls are so well defined that a whole new personality emerges with the shift, we have a person, of course, below the 2.0 band. Such people ordinarily run in Dianetics quite noisily and are called screamers. The Visio of such people is normally present for the valence in which the preclear is at the moment. If he is in father's valence, he will get the same view of the scenery that father would get. Or he may be in mother's valence, in which case he would have a view of the scene just as mother would see it. Or he may be in a synthetic valence, the valence of no actual person, which might give him a view of the scene looking down from the ceiling. Such cases almost never have their own point of view. Even valence walls are a sort of protective mechanism by which the charge of the case is compartmented to permit the individual to work at least some of the time. The truly low-power individual merely continues to accumulate charge until he is suppressed to the near bottom of the scale without ever developing a mechanism to overcome the charge. As far as his recalls are concerned, he is continually in his own valence, and in Visio will get the scene just as he himself saw it. Just as in Sonic, Visio manifests itself all the way down to the bottom of the case when the mental structure is insufficient to compartment off for the use of I any portion of the analyzer. Dub in Visio actually has two subdivisions. 1, where the actual scenery is approximated. 2, where entirely new scenery is substituted. The first is caused by valence shifts. The Visio the person gets of the scene when he is being acted upon by a valence shifter, highly charged up as in any secondary engram, is exteriorized, which is to say, he sees himself as part of the scene. He may be in the valence of another person, or he may be merely out in the blue looking at the scene. When the charge is run off of this particular scene by repeating it over several times, providing any release takes place in the first 4 or 5 recountings, the engram on which this secondary is depending, and which of necessity, if it creates such an illusion, must contain a valence shifter command, loses some of its charge, and the individual is then able to get inside of himself and get a view of the scene as he saw it at the time. Any engram in which the preclear is exteriorized cannot be fully discharged until the Visio is restored to the scene as it was viewed by the preclear. In other words, if the preclear continues to be exteriorized, the whole charge is not off the engram. However, if any charge at all can be gotten off a secondary, the auditor should run it to exhaust all possible charge. If Visio persists in being exteriorized in spite of many runnings of the incident, there is usually later charge on the case, a later secondary which has to be tapped and discharged first, since physical pain runs from early to late and secondaries have to be discharged from late back to early. Imaginary exteriorizations are most chronic around 1.1. In such cases, the auditor may sometimes use the mechanism of running the preclear on somebody else's track, which is to say on father's track or mother's track or grandfather's track, in order to contact scenes. In such cases, it is as if the person's track had been swallowed up, leaving available only the tracks of other valences around the individual. This mechanism is of very limited use. In any apathy secondary, the preclear may commonly be found to be outside himself until the charge is off the incident, at which time he becomes interiorized. There is always a valence shifter somewhere in a physical pain engram which creates this illusion. Charge itself will not cause a person to be exteriorized, as evidenced by people who have highly charged tracks and who yet remain in valence all the way to the bottom of the scale. In the very occluded case, Visio is the most notably absent thing. The preclear may think that Visio is necessary for him to scan locks, but this is not true. He can scan through locks in the dark with no Visio whatever, and yet bring to his consciousness phrases or incidents which can be run. The auditor must not make the mistake of believing that Visio is necessary for the individual to move on his track. Very little is known of the reasons for Visio, and no large body of observation exists to determine the state of Visio in all persons that have been cleared of their engrams. This much has been observed, however, that Visio does return in a clear, and any effort to palm off as a clear an individual who yet does not have an interiorized Visio on his track is a dishonest one. Most children have Visio for the simple reason that their engrams are not yet charged up to a point where secondaries can be formed, and so occlude Visio or thrust the child out of valence. In a case which has many valence shifters, affinity, reality, and communication secondaries will bring about a chronic exteriorized Visio case. In a case which has an analyzer sufficiently able to block off charge, Visio starts to disappear in the presence of repeated secondaries. After a major ARC break, such as the loss of a sweetheart, Visio may cut out in such a case entirely. Also, in the case of an individual who is stuck in a prenatal engram, Visio is blocked off by the simple fact that the prenatal Visio of black is present through all of his memories. He is not, of course, moving on the track and so cannot pick up the scenery of any incidents but those in which he is stuck. Visio is not a good test of the tone level of a case, except in the generality that when visio is present and accurate and other columns on the tone scale agree, the person can be said to be above the 2.0 line. But in view of the fact that visio can exist all the way down the track, such a test must be considered only cursory. Chapter 12. Column J. Somatic. The word somatic means, actually, bodily or physical. Because the word pain is restimulative, and because the word pain has in the past led to a confusion between physical pain and mental pain, the word somatic is used in Dianetics to denote physical pain or discomfort of any kind. It can mean actual pain, such as that caused by a cut or a blow, or it can mean discomfort, as from heat or cold. It can mean itching. In short, anything physically uncomfortable. It does not include mental discomfort such as grief, which would be misemotion. Hard breathing would not be a somatic. It would be a symptom of misemotion suppression. Somatic means a non-survival physical state of being. It is distinguished on the one hand from a non-survival mental state of being, and on the other hand from a physical action or pro-survival perceptic, such as kinesthesia or tactile or visio. An engram has several component parts. The two main components, of course, are n-theta and n-mest. Free theta has come into collision with mest, with resultant inturbulation. In a living organism, the n-mest component would be the manifested somatic. The chief difference between the analytical and reactive minds, aside from their functions, is that the reactive mind registers pain and the analytical mind merely records the fact that pain exists. This gives the reactive mind an additional perceptic. This perceptic is called a somatic. In the presence of any physical pain, the analyzer goes off. Even if the pain is very mild and brief, there is still a moment of analytical shutoff. In Dianetics, this is called anaton, an engineering type of abbreviation for analytical attenuation. The anaton buries the somatic, and unfortunately buries with it all the perceptics present when the somatic was received. It may be difficult to realize that anaton is present with every somatic until one has mildly injured his finger, for example, and has gone back over the incident a few times. He will discover that there was an incident during the injury which became occluded because of anaton, and by running the incident 2 or 3 times, he will find some additional perceptics which he may not before have noted. Thus, the somatic is buried by this mechanism of anaton. This is a workable mechanism in a life organism which is not analytically capable of recovering pain and running it out. But it is not workable in a rational organism possessed of considerable analytical power, since the perceptics of the painful moment can then react back against the analytical power, and the organism is then victimized by its somatics, rather than trained into the avoidance of danger by the avoidance of pain, the evident primary use of somatics. A severe physical pain causes considerable analytical attenuation, shutting off the analyzer thoroughly for a period of time. This, technically, is an engram, although any incident, painful or not, contained in the reactive mind and occluded by anaton can be considered an engram. Once an engram exists, analytical experiences can restimulate it by approximating its perceptics or breaking the dramatization demanded by the engram. These analytical moments are called locks, and they charge up the engram. There are, technically speaking, 2 types of such locks. Those which merely restimulate the engram, which is then dramatized by the individual, and those which break the dramatization. The first type are not as severe as the second type, since the second type, by making it impossible for the individual to obey the mandates of the engrams, cause the physical pain to turn on, and the individual gets what has been known as a psychosomatic illness. A psychosomatic illness, according to Dianetic findings, is the somatic side of the engram turned on by continual suppression of the dramatization. Thus, in Dianetics, psychosomatic illnesses are not regarded as such, but are called chronic somatics, since they disappear once the engram and its locks are discharged from the case. Another manifestation than anaton occurs with regard to a physical pain. the somatic interbulates theta, and if the analytical incident which forms a lock on this engram contains considerable misemotion, as caused by fear or loss, the presence of the physical pain earlier in the bank makes it possible for a secondary engram to be formed. Misemotion is actually a conversion of physical pain, according to Dianetic findings. There is much more that could be discovered about this mechanism of conversion of physical pain to, for instance, terror or grief or apathy, and the discovery probably lies in the field of further examination and understanding of free theta. But it is certain that secondary engrams with their misemotion occlude somatics. When the misemotion is discharged, the engram itself then becomes available. Indeed, so intimate is the relationship between misemotion and physical pain that the case is run by layers. One may discover early in the case many physical pain engrams which easily discharge when recounted. This brings to light a long series of secondary engrams later in the case. One is unable to find any further physical pain engrams until one has discharged these secondaries of their fear, grief, and apathy. Having done this, the auditor will find that he has a new series of physical pain engrams available for running. A somatic, then, may be said to be buried beneath anaton and beneath misemotion, or secondary engrams. Thus, somatics in a case can be seen to hide. Somatics can be turned on by Dianetic auditing only when the anaton and the misemotion are not too heavy for the particular somatic the auditor is trying to reach. A very heavily charged case, by which is meant a case with a very heavy burden of secondaries, may be found to have no somatics available for auditing. A very occluded case, in which the mind has compartmented off charge, will also have blocked off the majority of the somatics. The case which is stuck thoroughly on the time track may have in constant restimulation the somatic which was present at the moment he received the engram in which he is stuck. The characteristic of the psychotic is that the entheta side of the engram is in constant action and that the somatic side of the engram is not particularly active. The case which was formerly referred to as the psychosomatically ill case would be said to be one in which the entheta side of the engram is suppressed and the somatic side of the engram is in restimulation. These chronic somatic cases are usually found to be cases which have been subjected throughout life to breaking of each and every dramatization, cases, in other words, which have been denied the MEST control irrationally directed by the engrams, as well as the MEST control rationally directed by theta. The tone scale of somatics could begin at the top with the MEST clear at 4.0, who would have no somatics left to be run. This is the technical definition of the MEST clear, that each and every incident that contained physical pain during his entire lifetime, from conception forward to present time, has been erased, thus freeing the theta, which has been held as N theta in the bank, by freeing the body of pain or potential pain. This does not mean, by the way, that the clear cannot receive new pain and new engrams. It does mean that new incidents of pain will have much less effect on him than they would were he not a clear, and he can ordinarily run out such incidents by himself unless he has been from the start a very low theta power individual. In the 3.5, 3.0, and 2.5 bands, somatics are sharp and readily available to the auditor. Almost any engram on the case can be run, providing the basic on its chain and other preceding engrams have been erased before it. Slightly above 2.0, engrams begin to be suppressed by charge and anaton on the case. In a heavily occluded case who is yet in the 2.0 band, somatics may all but be absent. In a less occluded case in the 2.0 band, somatics may be very light. In a case which is in valence and yet in the 2.0 band and which can move on the track, somatics are available and can be run. Around 1.1, the heavily occluded case will have no somatics available. The auditor must here work solely for the discharge of locks and secondaries before he can find somatics on the case. In the less occluded case, however, some light somatics will be found available. And in the unoccluded case, which is yet at 1.1, somatics will be found to be extremely light and again will not discharge adequately until locks and secondaries are run. At the 0.5 level, somatics in the occluded case, the partially occluded case, or the wide-open case, will be found to be so light as to be practically non-existent, according to usual experience. Below this level, somatics do not exist at all. The auditor should very thoroughly recognize, then, somatics for what they are, the physical pain of past injuries. He should recognize further that it is the somatic in the first place which makes locks and secondaries possible. And he must further realize that somatics are buried beneath anaton and misemotion when these are present. He must not believe, however, that just because somatics make locks and secondaries possible, his primary mission is to run somatics off the case. Of course, he is trying to get the physical pain engrams off the case. But where somatics are not easily available, he must be very chary of trying to find them, and should devote himself to locks and secondaries rather than somatics. He will discover that by discharging locks and secondaries, he can very often relieve what have been called psychosomatic illnesses. Running somatics is the act of putting the case into permanent good shape. Running locks and secondaries is a much more rapid way of raising the tone of the case. However, that tone can fall again so long as engrams remain. It is theoretically possible to bring a case up to 3.0 or 3.5 without ever running a somatic. But this is not possible in common experience, and one has to run physical pain engrams when they offer themselves, save in those cases where so little free theta is available that, by running a somatic, the remaining free theta may become turbulated and involved with the engram, forming a new lock in auditing. Such an act can take the borderline psychotic down into the psychotic band. This is prevented by addressing locks and secondaries on the borderline case, rather than somatics. The auditor should not try for specific somatics in the case in the hope of relieving chronic illnesses. He can best address a specific chronic somatic by running locks and secondaries involved with that somatic. Merely by running the pre-clear through various parts of his life, up and down the track, the auditor may relieve enough anaton and misemotion from the case to permit somatics to occur. This was once upon a time known as greasing the track. However, one should not run a pre-clear into a somatic unless one intends to reduce it or to discover the basic on the chain and reduce that. Once somatics are contacted, they must be reduced. If they do not easily reduce on a few recountings, an earlier engram or a chain of locks or a secondary should be found, which inhibits the somatic from reducing. It is the somatic which predisposes a case to illness. An old physical pain in an area of the body weakens that area to the extent that there is a remembered injury in it. Body fluids approach the area with caution. When that old injury is restimulated, the approach of body fluids is inhibited even more. And so the area is denied more and more the nourishment, support, repair, and protection which the general flow of fluids in the body is designed to bring about. Bacteria are then able to enter the area and maintain themselves, and an illness can result, according to theory and according to what has been observed while working with Dianetics on many people. If the somatic in the area is heavy, the presence of bacteria may further restimulate it, and so the illness is perpetuated and becomes a chronic infection. In the case of a simple pain, known to doctors as strange, bizarre pains, or of rheumatoid arthritis, it may only be that the somatic itself is restimulated, and the reduction of the somatic is often attended by the sudden loss of the psychosomatic illness. This is not to make the claim that removing the somatic cures a psychosomatic illness. Such a claim is specifically forbidden by law as applied to past healing arts. Clinical experience, however, law or no law, demonstrates this to be a workable theory in practice. Any law which would seek to force people to remain ill when they might be well would be an evil law. Furthermore, the laws of man have never been able to do much to suppress the laws of God. Chapter 13. Column K. Speech talks. Speech listens. Probably the most accurate index for the auditor of the pre-clear's position on the tone scale is speech. Here is a generalized manifestation of perceptic communication. Engrams can induce by specific command too much talking, too little talking, too much listening to other people, or too little listening. Throughout the chart, there is this liability that the individual is operating upon compulsive or obsessive commands regarding one or more of the columns. The average position on the columns is the most important. A manic telling a person to talk continuously or a suppressive engram requiring a person to do nothing but listen will produce such behavior. But unless a person talks openly and listens receptively, he cannot be considered very high on the tone scale. There are double boxes in the speech column, one set referring to talking, the other to listening. It may not have occurred to some people that communication is both outgo and income. An observation of how a person both listens and talks will make it possible to form an opinion as to whether or not the person is operating on an engrammic command, either about listening or about talking, because usually one or the other, talking or listening, will be an accurate indication of his position on the tone scale. A person who is not operating on engrammic commands which deny or enforce either talking or listening will talk and listen more or less equally. Mind operation being what it is, as a person drops lower and lower on the tone scale, his affinity potential, his reality potential, and his communication potential also drop. Thus, by entirely mechanical means, we get reduction of visio, sonic, somatic recall, all other perceptics, and talking and listening. The highest level of the scale contains the faculty of communicating completely and withholding nothing, also the ability to communicate with complete rational selectivity, also the ability to be conversationally creative and constructive. At this high level of the scale, the individual is able to listen to everything which is said and evaluate it rationally. He can listen to entheta communications without becoming severely enturbulated. He can receive ideas without making critical or derogatory comments. And while receiving another person's ideas, he can greatly aid that person's thinking and talking. At the level of 3.5, the individual is capable of communicating deeply felt beliefs and ideas to others, and can communicate with others selectively, which is to say, he can cut off entheta lines and hold back or give forth conversation according to the rational or pleasant circumstances of the moment. The individual at this level can listen without becoming critical and can aid and assist others in conversation, but he is apt to become enturbulated slightly if given entheta conversation. Between 3.5 and 3.0, the ability of a person to talk to others decreases to a tentative expression of a limited number of beliefs and ideas and borders on the conservative. He may have a very conservative reaction toward people who have highly creative and constructive ideas. He is critical of flagrant irrationalities. In other words, from 3.5 down to 3.0, we are in a band where injury from life has created a defensiveness on the part of the individual. At 3.0, the speech of the individual becomes more casual and reserved. Here is the level of small talk about weather and good roads. At this level, the individual has a resistance toward ideas which are too massive. An analytical fear is expressed here of being not quite at ease. At 2.5, we have the level of indifference to conversation with others, a let's not argue about it attitude, a dismissal of communication, a carelessness as to whether one's conversation is being received or is even understandable. Between 2.5 and 2.0, we have a level where communication from other people is refused and where one does not talk. At 2.0, we reach a level of antagonistic conversation. The individual is apt to nag or to make derogatory comments to invalidate other people. On this level, the individual can only be roused by nagging, nasty cracks, invalidations, and other antagonistic communication. At the 1.5 tone level, we have a shutting off of other person's conversation, a complete refusal to listen and efforts to destroy incoming conversation. The conversation which is given forth by an individual at this level is forthrightly destructive and is given without any thought of the possible retaliation which may result from this destructiveness. Conversation on this level could hardly be called conversation, as it is a forward motion toward destruction and a refusal to accept anything which might prevent that destruction. Below this level, before we reach 1.1, the individual sinks into stubborn silence, sulks, refuses to talk, He will not listen to any communication of any kind from other people, except that which encourages him in his attitude. At 1.1, we have lying to avoid real communication. It takes the form of pretended agreement, flattery, verbal appeasement, or simply a false picture of the person's feelings and ideas, a false facade, an artificial personality. Here is the level of covert hostility, the most dangerous and wicked level on the tone scale. Here is the person who smiles while he inserts a knife blade between your vertebrae. Here is the person who tells you how he has stood up for you when actually he has practically destroyed your reputation. Here is the insincere flatterer who yet awaits only a moment of unguardedness to destroy. The conversation of this level is filled with small barbs which are immediately afterwards justified as intended compliments. Talking with such a person is the maddening procedure of boxing with a shadow. One realizes that something is wrong, but the guardedness of a 1.1 will not admit anything wrong, even as all the while he does his best to upset and wreak havoc. This is the level of the pervert, the hypocrite, the turncoat. This is the level of the subversive. From such a person one should never expect an outright frontal attack. The attack will come when one is absent, when one's back is turned, or when one sleeps. Any luckless person married to a 1.1 is, literally speaking, in danger of his life and sanity, for such a person is incapable of any real affection. Such a person is so introverted that any demonstrated affection is a hectic sham. Such a person will opportunistically take any avenue which leads to his own security and will leave in the lurch anyone he has pretended to call his friend. A 1.1 is the most dangerously insane person in society and is likely to cause the most damage. Because of the covert nature of this insanity, it is completely beside the point whether such a person is pronounced insane by any agency. On this level, there is no concept of honor, decency, or ethics. There is only desperate, death-bent thought of self and of damage to others. Society can handle the angry man. It knows what to expect from him. Society can handle the apathy case. His insanity is obvious. But the 1.1 is a skulking coward who yet contains enough perfidious energy to strike back, but not enough courage ever to give warning. Such people should be taken from the society as rapidly as possible and uniformly institutionalized, for here is the level of the contagion of immorality and the destruction of ethics. Here is the fodder which secret police organizations use for their filthy operations. One of the most effective measures of security that a nation threatened by war could take would be the rounding up and placing in a cantonment away from the society of any 1.1 individual who might be connected with government, the military, or essential industry, since here are people who, regardless of any record of their family's loyalty, are potential traitors, the very mode of operation of their insanity being betrayal. In this level is the slime of society, the sex criminals, the political subversives, the people whose apparently rational activities are yet but the devious writhings of secret hate. A 1.1 can be accurately spotted by his conversation, since he seeks only to enturbulate those around him, to upset them by his conversation, to destroy them without their ever being aware of his purpose. He listens only to data which will serve him in his enturbulations. Here is the gossip. Here is the unfaithful wife. Here is the card cheat. Here is the most undesirable stratum of any social order. No social order which desires to survive dares overlook its stratum of 1.1s. No social order will survive which does not remove these people from its midst. The 1.1 is so low on the tone scale and yet so active mentally as a rule that he is very difficult to process. The longest and most arduous course of therapy may still leave the auditor baffled by a mind which is so full of circuits that no real desire for improvement on the part of the preclear can make itself felt. The auditor may feel that only an offer of an obvious present-time advantage, like being let out of confinement, would tempt this preclear into genuine cooperation. The auditor may feel that this case is just not salvageable. But if in the case the auditor can manage to remove some of the circuits or destimulate them, he may be able to make progress. It takes a very clever dianetician to do anything with a chronic computational 1.1. The 0.5 talks dolefully and hopelessly in terms of bad things which are happening and will happen, and for which there is no remedy. He listens only to such conversation. He cannot be heartened or cheered up, but will slump immediately into his apathy. Here is hopelessness. At 0.1, we have an inability to talk and an individual who is completely unresponsive to conversation. It is interesting to note that the auditor can, with this column, conduct what we call a 2-minute psychometry on the pre-clear. The trick is simply to start talking to the pre-clear at the highest possible tone level, creatively and constructively, and then gradually drop the tone of one's conversation down to the point where it achieves response from the pre-clear. An individual best responds to his own tone band, and an individual can be lifted only about half a point on the tone scale by conversation. In doing this type of psychometry, one should not carry any particular band of conversation too long, not more than a sentence or two, because this will have a tendency to raise slightly the tone of the pre-clear and so spoil the accuracy of the test. 2-minute psychometry, then, is done first by announcing something creative and constructive and seeing whether the pre-clear responds in kind, then giving forth some casual conversation, perhaps about sports, and seeing if the pre-clear responds to that. Getting no response, the auditor starts talking antagonistically about things about which the pre-clear knows, but not, of course, about the pre-clear, to see if he achieves a response at this point. The auditor may then give forth with a sentence or two of anger against some condition. Then the auditor can indulge in a small amount of discreditable gossip and see if there is any response to that. If this does not work, then the auditor dredges up some statements of hopelessness and misery. Somewhere in this range, the pre-clear will agree with the type of conversation that is being offered. That is, he will respond to it in kind. A conversation can then be carried on along this band where the pre-clear has been discovered, and the auditor will rapidly gain enough information to make a good first estimate of the pre-clear's position on the chart. This 2-minute psychometry by conversation can also be applied to groups. That speaker who desires to command his audience must not talk above or below his audience's tone more than a half a point. If he wishes to lift the audience's tone, he should talk about a half a point above their general tone level. An expert speaker, using this 2-minute psychometry and carefully noting the responses of his audience, can in 2 minutes discover the tone of the audience, whereupon all he has to do is adopt a tone slightly above theirs. In Italy and Germany, when an entire people were at the level of 1.0 or slightly below, 2 death talkers, Mussolini and Hitler, were received by great crowds with wild enthusiasm. A powerful saint could have come forth and talked to these people in the most creative and constructive terms and would have had no response from them at all. This phenomenon has led historians to believe erroneously that individuals were created by the moment and that the moment was not created by the individual. Some instinct prompted these extinct leaders of Europe to seek and find the point on the tone scale at which they could most rapidly seize the attention of their audiences. It so happens that anyone in the 1.5 band will bring about disaster regardless of his stated intentions. A death talker can bring an entire people up to anger and hold them there long enough to destroy them, as did Mussolini and Hitler during the second phase of World War II.